The nib scratched, a dry, insect-like chirrup against the grain of the paper, before the flow stalled entirely. Henry lifted the fountain pen, angling the barrel towards the grey, watery light that seeped down from the parapet. Inside the glass reservoir, the ink had thickened into a sluggish, black sludge, clinging to the walls like cold treacle in winter. He flicked his wrist sharply, a desperate gesture to dislodge the clot, but the chill of Ploegsteert wood had seized the fluid just as it had numbed his fingers to the bone. Beneath his boots, the earth breathed. It was no metaphor. The clay actually heaved, a slow, viscous exhale of water and rot that sought to drag anything resting upon it into the deep. Henry drew his knees higher onto the overturned ration box. The wood groaned under his weight, a sharp complaint in the damp air, as he strained to keep the hem of his khaki tunic from dipping into the slurry that coated the trench floor. "Dearest Mother," he wrote, forcing the letters small and tight to conserve the precious space, "the ground here is unlike anything in Brockley." It was a falsehood, though not one the censor's blue pencil would strike out. It was a lie of scale. In Bromley, mud was a mere nuisance, a thing to be brushed from one's boots upon the mat before entering the parlor, a transient state between the rain and the sunshine. Here, the mud was a predator. It possessed a suction so violent it could strip a boot from a foot, holding the leather captive while the man stumbled forward, stockinged and shivering, into the wire. Only that morning, a lad from Stepney, no older than 16 and still wearing the crisp, stiff collar of a clerk, had lost his 3 Egrave boot to the floor. Henry had watched the boy, pale and trembling, digging frantically with a bayonet at the grey ooze, clawing at the clay until his fingernails snapped and bled, trying to retrieve Thess' registered acute copyright before the earth claimed it wholly. The boy had recovered only the sole, severed from the upper, the stitching burst by the sheer, crushing pressure of the ground. Henry dipped the pen once more. A single, heavy drop of black fell, splattering onto the page. He blotted it swiftly with his thumb, smearing the fresh ink into a dark cloud that bore a terrible resemblance to a shell burst. The air hung heavy, a physical weight against the face. It reeked of wet wool, sour and rank, mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of cordite that never quite dissipated, even when the guns fell silent for a spell. Underneath it all lay thescent of fungal rot, the damp, sickly sweet decay of drying putties and organic matter that had no business being unearthed. It was distinct from the clean, loamy perfume of the garden soil Alice tended behind their house in Brockley, where earth signified growth, potatoes, and dahlias in full bloom. Here, the earth signified only containment. It waited. He lifted his gaze from the letter, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dimness of the fire trench. The horizon, visible through a jagged gap in the sandbags, was a scarred and broken thing. Where hawthorn bushes had once formed a dense, impenetrable thicket along the edge of the wood, now stood only grey splinters. Shredded by shrapnel until they resembled the picked bones of some great, dead beast. No leaves remained. No birds sang. The silence of the wood was not peaceful. It was a held breath, a waiting room for the next barrage. "We are quite comfortable," Henry wrote, the pen moving faster now, driven by a desperate need to fill the silence with something other than the truth. "The rations have been regular, and the men are in good spirits." Beside him, a rhythmic sound cut through the damp air. SHHH, SHHH, SHHH. Arthur Emery sat with High's back against the clay wall, his legs stretched out into the trench, heedless of the seepage soaking into his trousers. In High's lap rested a small oilstone dark with use, and in High's hand the bayonet of his short magazine Lee Enfield. He drew the steel across the stone with a steady, practiced motion, thingle precise, the pressure even. His hands were broad, callow said from years of labor in the London docks before the war, and he did not tremble, not once. While the younger clerks jumped at the snap of Atwig or the distant thud of a mortar, Arthur's hands remained as still as the stone itself. He did not look up as Henry wrote. His focus was entirely in the edge of the blade, testing it with the pad of his thumb, feeling for the bite of the steel. "Smells of damp earth, this tobacco," Arthur said, his voice low, a rough baritone that seemed to vibrate in the confined space. He tapped the bowl of his pipe against his boot, dislodging a clump of ash that fell into the mud with a soft hiss. "Not leaf. Tastes like I'm smoking the trench floor itself." Henry paused, Thepin hovering over the word spirits. He watched Arthur's profile, the strong jaw, the calm eyes that refused to scan the parapet unnecessarily. There was a stoicism to the man that Henry found both enviable and terrifying. It was an acceptance of the inevitable, accurate understanding that the mud, the cold, and the steel were simply facts of existence, no more worthy of complaint than the rain in November. It's the moisture, Henry replied, capping the pen to stop the ink from freezing again. Gets into everything, even the paper. Arthur nodded, finally looking up. His gaze met Henry's, steady and unflinching. Keep writing, Henry. Your mother will want to know you are still holding the pen. Henry looked back down at the page. The words good spirit stared up at him, bold and fraudulent. He thought of the night before, the rat. It had been massive, a brute of a creature with fermented ingress scuttling across his haversack while slept. It had paused, sniffing at the lace of his boots, its eyes reflecting the faint glow of a tallow candle, before dragging a scrap off uniform grey wool, not khaki, into the shadows of the dugout. It had been feeding. Henrik knew what it had been feeding on. The thought made his stomach turn, a cold knot of nausea tightening in his gut. He moved Thepin to the line below. "A friendly cat was seen near the cookhouse yesterday," Hugh wrote, the nib digging into the paper. "Black and white, it reminded me of Theonere in the garden." The nib scratched a final full stop into the fibrous paper. Black ink pooled in the period, glossy and wet, refusing to soak into the damp sheet. Henry blew on it gently. The air from his lungs vanished into the trench mist, invisible. He set the pen down on the ration box beside the inkwell, the metal clinking softly against the wood. Arthur's rhythmic shhh continued, a steady metronome measuring out the minutes, while the lie about the cat dried on the page. A clatter echoed from the communication trench behind them. Metal struck earth. A curse followed, sharp and bright. "Bloody hell, this clay's got teeth." Fred Miller scrambled over the fire step, boots slipping on the slick duckboards before he found purchase. He leaned against the wall, chest heaving, a steaming tin can held high in one gloved hand to keep it from spilling. Mud coated his puttees up to the knee, thick and grey like wet cement. He grinned, wiping a smear of muck from his cheek with the back of a wrist. "Nearly lost it there, Henry. Thought I'd be swimming with the fishes before I got here." "Tea?" Henry asked. "Hot as hellfire." Fred, having found a working stove back at the cookhouse, a miracle of the age, shoved the tin towards Henry. "Share it out. Arthur looks like he could use a wake-up." Arthur stopped sharpening. He inspected the blade edge against the dim light, satisfied, and tucked the bayonet back into its scabbard with a sharp click. He took the tin from Fred, holding it with both hands to warm his fingers before taking a sip. Steam curled around his nose. "Thanks, socks," Arthur said. "Call me that again and I'll stitch your socks together while you sleep." Fred dropped down onto the trench floor, heedless of the soak. He pulled a packet of cigarettes from his tunic, the paper soft with moisture. Heard something odd coming from across the way. Earlier. Henry picked up the pen again, recapping it. Odd how. Singing, not shouting, singing. As Fred struck a match against his boot heel, the sudden flare illuminated the deep lines around his eyes, revealing the exhaustion buried beneath his boisterous mask. He inhaled while the ember glowed bright orange. Sounded like hymns, perhaps still knacked or something like it, German throats, yet the tune felt familiar. Arthur swallowed the tea. He handed the tin back to Henry. "They're Saxons opposite. Good lot usually, don't like the Prussians any more than we do." "Doesn't stop them shooting," Henry said, taking the tin as heat bit through the metal to scald his palms. He welcomed the pain because it proved he was still alive. "High Command won't like singing, which makes it harder to hate them." "High Command isn't here," Fred said, blowing smoke towards the parapet and watching it dissipate into the gloom. "Just us, and them, and the mud." Henry looked down at the letter. The lie about the cat sat next to the truth about the comfort. He folded the paper. The crease cracked, the fibers brittle from the damp. He reached into his tunic pocket and withdrew a small stick of sealing wax and a match. Striking the match, he held the flame to the wax end. A red drop fell onto the folded edge. He pressed his signet ring into it. The wax cooled instantly, hardening into a brittle seal. It cracked under the pressure of the ring, a fine hairline fracture splitting the crest. post going up? Fred asked. Soon, runners due. Tell them we're winning, Fred said, standing up to brush the mud from his trousers even as the clay clung stubbornly to the wool, refusing to fall. Tell them we're heroes. It makes the wait easier for them. I tell them we're warm, Henry said, and fed. Good enough, Fred clapped Henry on the shoulder. The grip was heavy, grounding. Don't write about the rats, Alice worries. Henry flinched, just a twitch of the shoulder that Fred didn't see, though Arthur did. Yet Arthur said nothing. I won't, Henry said. He stood up, knees popping. The trench floor sucked at his boots, holding him for a second before releasing with a wet squelch. He walked towards the communication trench, the letter clutched in his hand. The envelope felt heavy, weighted with everything he hadn't written. At the corner, the runner waited, a shadow against the sandbags. Young, barely 18, shivering slightly despite the thick greatcoat. For broccoli, Henry said. He handed over the envelope. The runner took it, tucking it into a waterproof pouch strapped to his chest. He nodded, not speaking. Words wasted breath. He turned and vanished into the mist of the communication trench, boots splashing in the unseen water. Henry watched him go. The fog swallowed the boy within 10 yards. 4 days, that's how long the paper would travel. 4 days for the letter to cross the channel, pass through the censors in Boulogne, sort through the depots in London, and land on the mat in Brockley. By the time Alice read that he was warm, the weather here might have broken. The frost could turn to liquid mud. The men singing hymns might be ordered to charge. The wax seal might crack further in the post. Arthur stepped up beside him, lighting his pipe again. The match flare died quickly. Gone? Arthur asked. Gone, Henry said. Good. Arthur turned back to the fire step. Keep your head down, rations at dusk. Henry stayed at the corner of the trench and listened as the wind shifted across no man's land, carrying a sound faint and distant that was neither a gun nor a shout, but a melody hummed by hundreds of voices, low and steady. Fred was right. It sounded like church, like home. Henry touched his pocket where the spare ink bottle lay. Glass against rib, cold. He thought of the hawthorn bushes shredded into grey splinters. He thought of the cat that wasn't there. He thought of the boy running into the mist with the truth folded inside a lie. The singing stopped, broken only when a single mortar round thudded into the earth somewhere far off, making the ground jump. Dust fell from the parapet onto Henry's shoulder, and he brushed it off. The dust was grey, like the clay, like the ash. Coming, Henry, Arthur called. In a minute, Henry said. He looked at the sky where clouds hung low, bruised purple and grey, leaving no stars, no moon, just the smoke. Turning back to the trench, he found the mud waiting as it always waited. He stepped down into it. The suction grabbed his boot until he pulled free and walked towards the candlelight. The letter was gone, yet the war remained. The cold had teeth. It bit through the wool of Henry's tunic, finding the thin skin over his ribs, settling there like a wet stone. He shifted on the overturned ration box, the wood digging into his thighs, and tried to ignore the seep of water rising through the sole of his left boot. The clay did not merely sit, it worked. It climbed. A slow, grey invasion that swallowed laces, then leather, then the warmth of the foot itself. Stock again. Arthur's voice came from the shadows of the dugout entrance, low and devoid of surprise. He sat with his back against the sandbag wall, the oilstone resting on his knee. In his right hand, the bayonet caught the flicker of the tallow candle. Steel flashed, dull and grey. SHHH, SHHH. The rhythm was steady, a metronome counting down minutes that belonged to no one. The mud has a grip, Henry said, as he twisted his ankle, feeling the suction break with a wet pop, like a pike holding fast to the riverbed. Segment 1, Pike don't live in this filth. Dialogue. Segment 2, Arthur paused his stroking. Action. Segment 3, he lifted the blade, squinting at the edge where the light caught a microscopic burr. Action plus. Henry looked down at the letter resting on his knees. The paper was damp, the fibers swollen with the humidity of the trench. He dipped his pen. The ink, black and viscous, clung to the nib, reluctant to flow in the freezing air. He had written 3 pages of careful lies. Dear mother, the weather is crisp. We are well fed. The billeting is comfortable. words that tasted like ash in his mouth. Now he needed to finish it. He needed to explain the night before without breaking her heart. He moved the pen to the bottom of the page. The nib hovered over the white space, trembling slightly. He wanted to write about the thing that had scuttled across his haversack at 300 hours. It had been massive, a beast of the trenches, its fur matted with grime, eyes reflecting the flare of a starshell as it tore at a strip of dried meat near the latrine bucket. It had paused, sniffing the air, its whiskers twitching, before scrambling over Henry's boot with a weight that felt deliberate, predatory. It was the size of a kitten, bold as brass, owning the trench while the men huddled in their greatcoats, afraid to move. "The rats are large here, Mother," he began to write. "One visited me in the night, bold as a house cat, and took her." He stopped. The image of Alice in the parlor at Brockley flashed behind his eyes. She would be sitting by the fire, the gas lamp hissing softly, her hands folded in her lap. She would read the word rat. She would see the creature not as a scavenger of war, but as a vermin infesting her son's bed, crawling over his face while he slept. She would imagine the disease, the filth, the sheer scale of the degradation. Her hands would tighten. The color would drain from her cheeks. She would spend the next week staring at the garden fence, wondering if the shadows in the corner held teeth. "No." Henry pressed the nib hard into the paper. The steel scratched, tearing the surface, ripping through the fibers of the lie he had just started. He dragged the pen sideways, obliterating the word rat, obliterating the description of the beast, turning the sentence into a black, jagged scar. Ink bloomed around the tear, a dark wound on the page. He scraped the paper with his thumbnail, trying to lift the wet ink, but it only smeared, making the mess worse. A small act of censorship. Before the officer with the black pencil saw it, before the postmaster in Boulogne judged it, he was doing the work of the state himself, pruning the horror to fit the shape of a mother's love. He took a breath. The air smelled of wet wool, of cordite residue, and something sweeter, cloyinger, the fungal rot of drying puttees hanging from the trench wall. "We saw a cat near the cookhouse yesterday," he wrote, forcing the letters to remain steady, forcing the lie to look like truth. "A stray, quite friendly, though I suspect it belongs to one of the officers. It reminded me of the tabby Mrs. Gable used to feed. They're safe, sanitized. A world where cats wandered freely and cookhouses were warm, a world that existed only on paper, 4 days away from reality." "Fixing the history?" Arthur asked, and though he hadn't looked up, the SHHHSHHH had resumed, rhythmic and hypnotic. "Editing," Henry said. He blew on the wet ink. It refused to dry, remaining a glossy, vulnerable smear. "Truth is too heavy for the post. It sinks the envelope." "Truth doesn't sink," Arthur said. He tested the edge of the bayonet with his thumb, a quick, practiced flick. "It just arrives late. By the time they read it, we are somewhere else, or we are not." Henry folded the letter. The crease cracked, the paper brittle from the damp. He reached into his tunic pocket and pulled out the stick of sealing wax. It was red, the color of fresh blood, hard and cold in his fingers. He struck a match against the rough wood of the ration box. The sulfur flare smelled sharp, cutting through the trench stench for a brief second. He held the flame to the wax. A single drop melted, glowing bright orange, then deepening to crimson as it fell. It landed on the folded edge of the envelope with a soft hiss. Henry pressed his signet ring into the pool. The metal was cold, shocking against the hot wax. He held it there, counting to 3, feeling the wax cool and harden around the crest of the Williamson family. A lion rampant, a symbol of strength that felt ridiculous here in the mud of Flanders. He lifted the ring. The seal was set, but as the wax contracted in the freezing air, a fine hairline fracture split the crest right through the lion's head. The wax was too cold, too brittle. It had cracked under the pressure of the ring, just as the men cracked under the pressure of the shelling. "Broken already," Henry murmured. "Everything breaks," Arthur said, sliding the bayonet back into its scabbard until the leather squeaked, a harsh sound in the quiet trench. "That's the job, to break things or get broken." Henry tucked the letter into his breast pocket next to his heart. The envelope felt heavy, weighted with the silence of what he had not said. The rat, the cold, the fear that sat in his gut like a lump of lead. He stood up. His knees popped, the joints stiff from the crouch. The trench floor sucked at his boots as he walked towards the communication trench, a greedy mouth trying to keep him. He pulled free with a wet squelch, leaving a deep impression in the clay that would fill with water within the hour. At the corner, the runner waited. A boy, really, no more than 18, with a face still soft, untouched by the grey fatigue that lined the older men. He shivered despite the thick greatcoat, his breath pluming in the air. He held a canvas sack open, ready for the post. "For broccoli," Henry said. His voice sounded rough, unused. The runner nodded. He took the envelope, his gloved fingers clumsy, and tucked it into the waterproof pouch strapped to his chest. He did not speak. Words wasted breath, and breath was heat. He turned and vanished into the mist of the communication trench, his boots splashing in the unseen water that ran along the bottom of the cut. Henry watched him go. The fog swallowed the boy within 10 yards, erasing him as if he had never been. 4 days. That was the constant, the immutable law of the postal lag. 4 days for the paper to cross the channel, to pass through the censors in Boulogne who would scan it for secrets and find none, to sort through the depots in London, and finally to land on the mat in Brockley. By the time Alice read that he was warm, the weather here might have broken. The frost could turn to liquid mud, sucking the boots from a man's feet. The men singing hymns across the wire might be ordered to charge, running into the machine guns that waited in the dark. The wax seal, already cracked, might shatter completely in the rough handling of the sorting office. And he would be here, still in the mud, still lying. Arthur stepped up beside him, lighting his pipe again. The match flare died quickly, consumed by the damp. "Gone?" Arthur asked. "Gone," Henry said. "Good." Arthur turned back to the fire step, his silhouette merging with the shadows of the parapet. "Keep your head down, rations at dusk." Henry stayed at the corner of the trench. He listened. The wind had shifted, coming from the east now, carrying the scent of frozen earth and something else, something human. Across no man's land, faint and distant, a sound rose above the moan of the wind, neither a gun nor a shout, but a melody hummed by hundreds of voices, low and steady. Fred was right. It sounded like church, like home. "Still nagged." Henry touched his pocket where the spare ink bottle lay. Glass against rib, cold. He thought of the hawthorn bushes shredded into grey splinters. He thought of the cat that wasn't there. He thought of the boy running into the mist with the truth folded inside a lie. The singing stopped. A single mortar round thudded into the earth somewhere far off, to the left. The ground jumped, a violent spasm that shook the loose soil from the parapet. Dust fell from the overhead beams onto Henry's shoulder. He brushed it off. The dust was grey, like the clay, like the ash. "Coming, Henry," Arthur called. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. "In a minute," Henry said. He looked at the sky. Clouds hung low, bruised purple and grey, pressing down on the trench like a lid. No stars, no moon, just the smoke churning in the stagnant air. He turned back to the trench. The mud waited. It always waited, patient and hungry. He stepped down into it, and the suction grabbed his boot, holding him for a heartbeat as if testing his resolve. He pulled free. Then he walked towards the candlelight. The letter was gone. The war remained. The canvas sack slapped into the mud with R1 thud, releasing a cloud of damp dust that smelled of salt water and the oily residue of the channel crossing. Henry shifted his weight against the wet earth, boots sucking softly as he leaned forward from the fire step. Names were called. The postman, a corporal with mud caked to his eyebrows like frozen moss, pulled bundles from the depths of the bag, his gloved fingers clumsy in the fading light. "Emery," the corporal said. He tossed a thin envelope towards Arthur. It landed face down in the slurry. "Miller, 2 for you, 1 looks like a bill." Fred laughed, a short bark that vanished into the trench walls. "Tell them I'm dead. Saves postage." "Willie Amson." The parcel was wrapped in brown paper, tied with string that had frayed at the knots. Henry reached out. His hand shook just once before he gripped the package. It felt solid, real. He pulled it into the trench, cradling it against the dirty wool of his tunic as if it were a wounded bird. From home, Arthur asked. He picked up his letter, wiping the mud off the front with his thumb. The paper tore slightly at the corner. Broccoli, Henry said. He could smell it before he broke the seal. Lavender, not the sharp, chemical scent of the disinfectant used in the latrines, but the dried, sweet dust of lavender bags kept in a linen cupboard. Underneath that, faint but undeniable, was the acrid tang of coal smoke. It was the smell of the kitchen range in November, of the neighbor's chimney pot 3 doors down, of a world where fire warmed rather than destroyed. Open it then, Fred said. He was tearing into his own envelope, teeth bared against the string. Don't hoard the warmth. Henry worked the knot. The string resisted, stiff with damp, then gave way. He peeled back the brown paper. Inside lay a knitted scarf, grey wool thick and uneven where his mother's hands had hurried the stitches, and a folded sheet of notepaper. The paper was crisp, white. It looked alien against the dark, rotting wood of the trench wall. Looks thick enough, Arthur said. He glanced over, his face shadowed by the rim of his Brody helmet, winds picking up from the east. It's not for the wind, Henry said. He held the letter. The ink was black, distinct, formed in his mother's looping hand. 20 November 1914. The date matched today, yet the words were written 4 days ago, in a house where the kettle whistled for tea and the floorboards did not tremble with the impact of high-explosive shells. He ran his thumb over the signature. Alice Williamson. The paper did not crumble. It did not smell of cordite. Read it aloud, Fred said, if there's news or food. There's no food, Henry said. Pity I'd trade a cigarette for a scone. Fred struck a match against his boot. The flare illuminated his face for a second, highlighting the hollows under his eyes before he cupped his hand around the flame. Go on, does she know we're winning? Henry looked at the first line. My dearest Henry, I hope this finds you well and warm. She knows I'm warm, Henry said. Then she's an optimistic woman, Arthur muttered, sliding the bayonet from his belt as the leather scabbard squeaked. Better than knowing the truth, which freezes faster than water. Henry tucked the scarf into his pocket. He kept the letter in his hand. The temporal dissonance sat in his gut like a stone. She wrote of the price of coal rising by 2 shillings a ton. She mentioned the vicar had moved the prayer meeting to Tuesdays. She asked if the French countryside was pretty this time of year, suggesting he sketched the trees for her. She did not know about the rats that nested in the sandbags. She did not know about the horse carcass bloating in the wire 50 yards ahead. Pretty, Henry said. The word felt false on his tongue. Trees, Arthur asked. He began to oil the blade, a rag moving in slow, circular motions. Any left? Some, Henry said. Sketch them then, Arthur said. If she asked, it keeps her busy and keeps you busy too. Henry folded the letter along the original creases. The paper crackled, a sharp sound in the quiet trench. He treated it with a care he reserved for fragile things, for birds' eggs or unexploded ordnance. This was more dangerous than the shell. This was hope. Wrap up, the corporal said. He was shouldering the empty sack, moving down the line to the next section. Officers coming round, check for lights. Dark as a grave anyway, Fred said. He blew out the match. Henry stood. The cold bit through his tunic, immediate and sharp. He wrapped the grey scarf around his neck. The wool itched, rough against his skin, but it held the heat of his own breath, trapping it close. He looked at the letter in his hand. The white square glowed faintly in the gloom. You going to write back? Arthur asked, not looking up as the oil rag continued its rhythm, shhh, shhh. Tonight, Henry said. Wait for the candle, Arthur said. Don't waste the ink in the dark. You'll scratch holes in the paper. Henry nodded. He slipped the letter into his breast pocket next to the skin. The paper warmed instantly. He could feel the weight of it against his ribs, a steady pressure with every heartbeat. Outside the trench, the wind moaned through the wire, a low, constant note that sounded like a voice calling from a great distance. Rations in 10, Arthur said. He stood up, testing the edge of the bayonet with his thumb. Bully beef, hard tack. Save me a slice, Fred said. Find your own, Arthur said. Henry turned towards the dugout. The earth wall beside him was slick with condensation, droplets running down like slow tears. He needed light. He needed ink. He needed to tell her that the trees were beautiful, that the food was hot, that the cold was nothing he couldn't handle. He needed to lie. He reached into his tunic for the fountain pen. The metal was cold as ice. The nib scratched, a dry, rasping sound against the fiber of the page, before a single drop of black ink bloomed and refused to move. It sat there, a glossy, viscous eye staring up from the paper, refusing to dry in the damp air of the dugout. Henry blew on it, his breath pluming white in the gloom, but the moisture only made the spots swell, spreading like a bruise across the thin notepaper. "Stuck," he muttered. Arthur shifted on the crate opposite, the wood groaning under the weight of his kit. He held the tallow candle steady with one hand, the flame guttering as the draft from the trench mouth found a path through the earth walls. The light threw long, dancing shadows that made the sandbags look like hunched figures waiting in the corners. "Warm the barrel," Arthur said, his voice low and stripped of urgency. "In your pocket. Body heat thins it." Henry capped the pen and shoved it back into his breast pocket, right over the folded letter from his mother. The metal bit into his sternum, cold and hard, but he left it there, pressing the fabric of his tunic against his ribs until the chill began to leach away. He could feel the outline of Alice's handwriting through the wool, the loops and curves of her questions burning against his skin more than the frost ever could. "Are the trees still green, Henry?" He closed his eyes. The image she wanted was a watercolor of Kent in late autumn, gold beech leaves drifting onto a manicured lawn, the crisp snap of a frosty morning walk, the vicar adjusting his scarf outside the church hall. That was the world of Brockley. That was the world where coal cost 2 shillings more and the neighbor's motor omnibus startled the horses on the high street. Here the trees were skeletons. He had seen a birch this morning, half shattered by a shell burst, its white bark peeled back to reveal the raw, wet wood beneath. It looked flayed. The leaves that remained were brown rags, clinging to the twigs with a desperate tenacity, shivering in the wind that carried the smell of wet clay and something sweetly rotten from the wire ahead. To sketch that would be to tear the paper she wrote on. To describe the mud that sucked at the boots, a thick, greedy clay that held the foot and refused to let go, would be to stain her parlor table with grease. "Got it?" Arthur asked. Henry pulled the pen out again. The metal was warmer now, tempered by his own blood. He uncapped it and touched the nib to the paper. The ink flowed, a thin, blue-black river forming the letters of a lie. "The countryside is very pretty, Mother. The trees are holding their color well." His hand cramped. The lie sat on the page, stark and terrible in its neatness. He wanted to cross it out, to scrape the paper with his thumbnail until the fibers frayed and the truth bled through, but he stopped. The candle flickered. A draft snaked down from the parapet, carrying the scent of the trench, stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, the sharp, ammonia tang of the latrines further down the line. "She asked about the vest," Henry said. He didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the next line, where he had to explain the food. "And told her I'm wearing it every night." "Good." Arthur took a bite of the hard biscuit he had saved. The crunch was loud in the small space, a violent snapping of dry dough. He chewed slowly, working the lump into something swallowable. "She worries about the damp, says it gets in the bones. She says the vicar moved the prayers to Tuesday." Arthur stopped chewing. He looked at the flame, his face a mask of gray shadows and sharp angles. "Tuesday, right." "Do you think she knows?" Henry asked. The question slipped out before he could catch it, naked and shaking. "About the mud, about the things in the wire." Arthur swallowed the biscuit dry. He wiped his mouth with the back of a grimy hand. "She knows what she needs to know, that you're writing, that you're thinking of her. The rest is just noise." "Noise," Henry repeated. "Static like a bad telephone line." Arthur leaned forward, shielding the candle with his cupped hand as the flame dipped dangerously low. "You write the pretty bits. She reads them and sees the garden in Brockley. That's the transaction. You give her the picture, she gives you the reason to stay here and look at the mud." Henry looked down at the page. "The food is quite good," he had written next. "We have hot meals regularly." It was a falsehood so large it felt physical, a stone lodged in his throat. The bully beef in his haversack was a solid block of grey fat and meat, cold and congealed, requiring a bayonet to cut. The tea was lukewarm, flavored with the taste of the tin it came in. There had been no hot meal in 3 days. The kitchen range in Broccoli was boiling kettles while he scraped frozen sludge from his mess tin. He dipped the pen again. The ink seemed thicker this time, reluctant. Fred sends his regards, he added. He is in high spirits. Fred was asleep 3 feet away, curled on a ground sheets that smelled of mildew, his face twitching in a dream that was likely no better than the waking world. High spirits. The words mocked him, but Alice would picture Fred laughing, perhaps telling one of his stories about the clerk's office, his hands waving in the air. She would not see the hollows under his eyes, the way he hoarded cigarettes like gold coins. "Pass the tin," Arthur said softly. Henry handed over the biscuit tin. Arthur took one, then closed the lid with a sharp click that echoed like a rifle bolt. He placed the tin between them, a shared reserve against the hunger that gnawed at the belly with dull, persistent teeth. "Write about the cat," Arthur suggested. He gestured vaguely towards the entrance of the dugout where the darkness pressed in, the one you saw near the cookhouse, black and white. "There is no cat," Henry said, insisting that not one roamed for miles since nothing lives here but the rats. "Then make one up." Arthur's eyes caught the candlelight, reflecting it with a strange, flat intensity. A black and white cat, sitting on a wall, watching the birds, she'll like that, reminds her of home. Henry hesitated. The nib hovered over the paper. To invent a life, to conjure a creature of warmth and fur into this landscape of steel and rot, felt like a sacrilege. And yet the image formed in his mind. A sleek cat, clean and dry, sitting on a brick wall in Broccoli, washing its paw in the sun. It was a vision so vivid it hurt. "A friendly cat was seen near the cookhouse yesterday," he wrote, the nib digging into the paper. "Black and white, it reminded me of the one in the garden." He blew on the wet ink. It refused to dry, remaining a glossy, vulnerable smear. "Truth doesn't sink," Arthur said, echoing his earlier thought as if he could hear the churn of Henry's mind. "It just arrives late. By the time they read it, we're somewhere else, or we're not anywhere at all." Henry didn't answer. He finished the sentence, adding a flourish to the period that looked too final, too much like a full stop on a life rather than a letter. He folded the page, the crisp sound echoing the earlier fold of his mother's letter. The symmetry was perfect and terrible. One packet of lies traveling east to comfort, one packet of love traveling west to deceive. He slid the letter into the envelope, sealing it with a lick of the flap that tasted of salt and iron. The wax of the candle dripped onto the seal, hardening instantly into a red tear. "Done?" Arthur asked. "Done. Give it to the runner in the morning, before the shelling starts." Henry stood up. His joints clicked, stiff with the cold that had seeped into the marrow of his bones despite the new scarf. He tucked the sealed envelope into his tunic pocket next to the empty space where his mother's words had been. The pocket felt lighter now, yet heavier. Outside, the wind had risen. It howled through the barbed wire, a high, keening sound that mimicked a human voice calling out in pain. The candle flame stretched thin and blue, then vanished, plunging the dugout into absolute darkness. "Lights out," Arthur said. His voice came from the dark, unchanged, solid as the earth wall. "Sleep while you can, dawn brings the snipers." Henry lay back on the ground sheets. The straw beneath him crunched, dry and brittle. He could smell the lavender from the parcel still, faint now, mingling with the reek of the trench. It was a ghost scent, a memory of a world that might no longer exist. He closed his eyes, but the image of the black and white cat remained, sitting on its wall watching birds that would never land in Flanders. Tomorrow the frost would come. He could feel it in the air, a tightening, a crystallizing of the moisture that would turn the top layer of mud to stone. It would make the walking easier for a few hours, until the sun rose and melted the crust, returning the world to its sucking, hungry state. He shifted, his hand resting on the envelope in his pocket. "Martha." "Sleep, Henry." "The trees," Henry whispered into the dark. "I didn't tell her they were dead." "They aren't dead," Arthur's voice drifted from the shadows, sleepy and distant. "Just waiting like us." Henry listened to the wind. It carried no answer, only the distant, rhythmic thud of a heavy gun somewhere beyond the lines, counting down the seconds to a morning that would bring no warmth, only the grey light of another day in the silence. He tightened his grip on the letter, holding it against his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping his heart from stopping, and waited for the dawn to break the night. The paper crinkled, a sharp, dry sound against the wet earth of the dugout floor. Henry smoothed the crease of his mother's letter one last time, the fibers rough under his thumb, before folding it into a square small enough to fit inside his pay book. He slipped the packet away, securing it against the damp seeping through the clay walls. The scent of lavender lingered on his fingers, a ghost of broccoli that refused to fade even here, even now. Arthur sat opposite, knees drawn up, the steel of his bayonet resting across his thighs. He worked a rag soaked in oil over the blade, the cloth leaving a dark, slick trail on the metal. The smell of cosmoline cut through the lavender, sharp and chemical, asserting the reality of the trench. He did not look up as Henry finished. The rhythm of his cleaning was steady, a metronome marking time in a place where clocks had no meaning. "Thick enough?" Arthur asked. Henry blinked. His hand went to his neck, fingers finding the wool of the new scarf. He had wrapped it loosely when the parcel arrived, more for the comfort of holding it than for warmth. Now he tightened the knot, pulling the fabric up until it brushed his chin. It scratched. The wool was coarse, dyed a muddy brown that matched the trench walls, but it held the heat of his own breath against his skin. "It will do," Henry said. Wind picks up after midnight, getting into the collar. Arthur tested the edge of the bayonet with his thumb, a quick, practiced flick. He asked about the wind rather than asking if Henry was warm or afraid. "Keep it on," he said, even in the dugout. Henry nodded. He unwrapped the brown paper from the parcel again, digging through the straw packing until his fingers found the tin. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled beside the scarf, were 6 hard biscuits wrapped in wax paper. They were ship's biscuit, hard as brick, meant to last a voyage around the world. Here they would last a week. He offered the tin to Arthur. Arthur shook his head. "Yours from home." "Joe." "Keep it." Arthur wiped the bayonet again, removing a smudge of oil that wasn't there. "You read the letter, you do the talking, I'll do the listening. That's the trade." Henry took one biscuit, holding it in his palm to feel its weight, dense and dry and unyielding. In broccoli, his mother would have softened it in tea, serving it on a plate with a rim of blue flowers, but here it was ammunition. He broke it in half. The snap was loud in the small space. Then he held out a piece. Arthur hesitated. Then he took it. He did not eat it immediately. He held it between his fingers, turning it over as if examining a strange coin. "She asks about the trees," Henry said. "Wants to know if they are pretty, if I can sketch them." Arthur put the biscuit in his mouth. He chewed slowly, the sound gritty like grinding stones. And Sentence 1, and nothing, dialogue. Sentence 2, Henry looked at the earth wall behind Arthur. Action. Sentence 3, the roots of the beech trees above ground poked through the clay like exposed veins. Tell her about the cat. Henry frowned. There is no cat. There is now. Arthur swallowed the dry crumbs, washing them down with a sip of water from his canteen. She wants pretty, give her pretty, a cat on a wall, sun on its fur, it costs nothing. It's a lie. It's a ration. Arthur capped the oil tin, the metal clicking shut. You send her truth, she starves. You send her lies, she eats. That's the job. Henry looked at the biscuit in his own hand. He took a bite. It tasted of flour and salt, nothing else. It stuck in his throat, demanding water to force it down. He realized then that Arthur understood the home front better than he did. Henry saw the disconnect as a wound, a gap between what was real and what was written. Arthur saw it as a bridge. You built it with whatever materials you had, even if they were fabricated. You built it so the people on the other side could walk across without falling into the mud. He finished the biscuit. He brushed the crumbs from his tunic, watching them fall into the dirt. They would be gone by morning, eaten by rats or soaked into the clay. Nothing remained. Pen, Arthur said. He nodded towards the ration box where Henry's fountain pen lay capped beside the inkwell. Get it done before the candle gutters. Henry reached for the pen, the metal so cold it leached the warmth from his fingers. He uncapped it to expose the nib, sharp and vulnerable, before dipping it into the inkwell. The fluid was dark, almost black, thick with the cold, and it clung to the nib while refusing to flow smoothly. He positioned the paper, a thin, fibrous sheet marked with the watermark of the regimental supplier. He hovered the nib over the surface. The ink trembled at the tip, a single drop waiting to fall. "Start with the weather," Arthur said. He lay back on his ground sheets, pulling his own blanket up to his chest. "She likes the weather, safe topic." Henry pressed the nib down. The paper resisted, then accepted the ink. A single blue line appeared, stark against the white. He wrote the date. 20 November 1914. The numbers looked formal, official, as if this were a ledger entry and not a letter to a mother who worried about coal prices. He paused. The candle flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the earth walls. The draft from the trench entrance stirred the air, carrying the smell of wet wool and the distant, metallic tang of the line. He could smell the lavender again, faint now, trapped in the folds of the scarf around his neck. It was a tether, a line thrown from Brockley to Ploegsteert, held tight on both ends. He wrote the salutation, "My dear mother." The ink flowed easier now, finding the groove of the paper. He did not look at Arthur. He did not look at the bayonet resting on the ration box. He looked only at the words forming under his hand, building the bridge plank by plank, lie by lie, until it was strong enough to hold the weight of the truth that would never cross it. Outside, the wind rose, whistling through the wire in a high, thin note that sounded like a bird calling in the dark. Henry did not flinch as he dipped the pen again into the inkwell, which was half empty and would need refilling soon. Nothing lasted forever, not ink, not biscuits, not men. He wrote on. The glass thermometer pinned to the dugout post read -4. Henry stared at the red line shrunken low in the stem. A blood vessel retreated from the extremities. Frost feathered the earth walls, crystalline blooms growing inward from the clay like white mold. He pulled his gloves off, finger by finger, exposing skin that had turned the color of old parchment. The air inside the shelter hung still and heavy, smelling of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the damp, fungal rot of drying puttees left too long in the corner. "Write it quick," Arthur said. He sat opposite, knees drawn up, sharpening a pencil with a knife that lacked half its blade, before the ink turns to jelly. "It is already jelly." "Then warm it." Henry uncapped the fountain pen. The metal barrel leached heat from his thumb instantly, a sharp bite that traveled up to the wrist. He dipped the nib into the well. The fluid stood black and viscous, sluggish as molasses in winter. He touched the nib to the paper, a fresh sheet reserved for Sicily, and pressed. Nothing happened. He pressed harder. The steel tines splayed, scratching the fiber, but no line appeared. The ink had frozen in the slit. He lifted the pen to his mouth. Breath clouded around the nib, white vapor condensing on the steel. He blew hard, warming the metal with the heat of his lungs, feeling the moisture freeze on his own lips. "Looks like a medical procedure," Fred Miller said from the shadows. He was peeling potatoes, the skins curling onto the floorboards. "Patient critical. Apply warmth to the extremities." "Shut it, socks," Arthur said. He didn't look up from the pencil. Henry tried again. A single drop formed, trembling at the tip, then fell. It bloomed on the page, a dark, irregular star. He dragged the nib across the paper. The line was jagged, skipping over the frozen ridges of the pulp. 10 December 1914. The numbers looked weak, anemic. He wanted to tell Sicily about the skylarks. 3 weeks ago, before the hard frost set in, they had risen from the wire each morning, spiraling into the grey sky, singing despite the shelling. Their song was a thin, bright wire pulled tight against the bass rumble of the guns. Now nothing. The fields held only the crows, scavengers waiting for the work to finish. He dipped the pen again. The ink flowed for 3 words, then stopped. The cold was inside the nib now, solidifying the water base faster than he could write. "It's no use," Henry said. He capped the pen, the click loud in the small space. "I can't get the words down." "Write less." "She asks about the birds. She wants to know if the woods are still singing." Arthur stopped sharpening. He blew the wood shavings from his lap, the fragments drifting into the mud. "Tell her yes." I can't lie to Cicely. You lie to Mother. Arthur picked up his bayonet, testing the edge against his thumb. What's the difference? One expects the truth, the other expects me to survive. Henry rubbed his hands together, trying to generate friction. The skin felt tight, ready to crack. He looked at the letter. The date sat alone at the top of the page, an island in a white sea, below it nothing. The blank space accused him. He knew what he should write. The larks are gone, the trees are stumps. The ground is hard as iron and holds the shapes of men who will not stand again. But the ink would not carry it. The cold refused the truth. He shoved the pen into his tunic pocket, against the chest, where the heart beat slow and thick. Maybe the body heat would thaw the feed. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the candle flame. It flickered in the draught from the trench entrance, casting long, dancing shadows that made the earth walls seem to breathe. Rations come at noon, Fred said. He dropped a peeled potato into a bucket of water. If the runners make it through the wire. They'll make it, Arthur said. Hawley sent them out at dawn. Hawley sends men out to die, doesn't mean they arrive. Henry ignored them. He pulled the pen out again. The metal was warmer now, tempered by his own blood. He uncapped it. A drop of ink hung ready. He touched it to the paper. It flowed. He wrote, "The weather is cold." He stopped. The words were worthless. Ash. Tell her about the cat, Arthur said. He resumed sharpening the pencil, the shhhshhh sound rhythmic, hypnotic. You invented one for Mother. Give Cicely a dog, something loyal. There is no dog. There is now, Arthur blew on the pencil point. She wants Pretty. Give her Pretty, a dog in the sun. It costs nothing. It's a lie. It's a ration, Arthur capped the knife. You send her truth, she starves. You send her lies, she eats. That's the job. Henry looked at the sentence. The weather is cold. It was true, but it was not the truth. The truth was that the cold had a weight, a pressure that pushed against the eyes and settled in the marrow. It was not weather, it was an enemy. He dipped the pen. The ink flowed smoother now, warmed by the pocket. He wrote, "We are quite warm in the dugouts." Another lie. The damp seeped through the wool, clinging to the skin like a second layer of dead flesh. He could feel the moisture in his socks, a cold slime around the toes. He wrote, "The food is sufficient." His hand cramped. He shook it out, the fingers stiff as twigs. The candle sputtered, the wick drowning in a pool of melted wax. Outside, the wind rose. It whistled through the wire, a high, thin note that sounded like a bird calling in the dark. Henry paused, pen hovering. The sound was not a bird. It was the wind caught in the barbed wire, singing a note of pure tension. Did you hear that? Fred stopped peeling. He held the potato suspended over the bucket. Hear what? Arthur asked. Sound like singing. Henry lowered the pen. The hair on his arms stood up, reacting to a shift in the air pressure he could not name. The wind died away, leaving a silence that pressed against the ears. In that quiet, a voice carried, clear baritone, drifting over the parapet from the German line. It was singing still knacked. Henry froze. The pen hovered over the paper, a drop of ink swelling at the nib, ready to fall and ruin the page. Arthur looked up, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. The song continued, joined by others, creating a harmony that clashed with the artillery silence. Put the paper away, Arthur said. His voice was low, barely a whisper. Henry did not move. The pull towards the wire was magnetic, a physical tug in the chest that fought against the instinct to hide. He looked at the blank space below the lie about the weather. He could not write this. The ink would freeze around the words. The censor would black it out. Hawley would court-martial him. Harry, Arthur said. He leaned forward, hand resting on the bayonet. Put it away. Henry capped the pen. The click sounded like a bolt sliding home. He closed the notebook, leather creaking, and shoved it into his tunic pocket beside the frozen ink. He stood up, knees cracking, and moved towards the steps leading to the fire step. Where are you going? Fred asked. Check the wire, Henry said. It's dark. Moon's up. Arthur watched him. He did not stop him. He simply picked up his rifle and checked the chamber, the metal sliding with a smooth, oiled sound. Keep your head down, Harry. Henry climbed the steps. The earth was hard under his boots, frozen solid, no longer sucking at the soles. He reached the parapet and gripped the sandbags. They were stiff with ice. He peered over the top. No man's land lay white under the moonlight, the craters filled with snow like shallow bowls. The wire glinted, a silver web stretching across the dead ground. Movement not hostile, figures standing in the open, midway between the lines. Henry gripped the sandbag tighter. The cold bit through his gloves. He should shout. He should report it. He should wake Hawley. Instead, he waited, watching the figures in the snow, listening to the song that belonged to neither side. A boot crunched on the frozen mud behind him. Heavy, deliberate, not Arthur. Henry did not turn. He knew the tread. Hawley, Arthur breathed from the shadows below, a warning stripped of panic but heavy with the weight of rank. Henry did not flinch. To move now would be to admit guilt, to scramble like a rat caught in a tin, and the captain despised scrambling almost as much as he despised the truth. The boot stopped inches from Henry's heel, the hobnails biting into the frozen crust of the parapet with a sound like grinding teeth. The air shifted, carrying the sharp, medicinal tang of strong tobacco and the dry dust of chalk that always clung to the officers' greatcoats, a scent of headquarters and clean collars that seemed impossible this deep in the mud. Private Williamson. The voice was low, devoid of the shouted orders that usually tore through the dawn, yet it carried a density that forced Henry's shoulders to tighten against his spine. He kept his eyes on the white expanse ahead, where the figures still stood, silhouetted against the snow, their voices weaving a melody that drifted over the wire like smoke. "Sir," Henry said. The word felt thick in his throat, swollen by the cold. Captain Hawley stepped up beside him, not looking at the Germans, not looking at the men in the grey coats who were lowering their rifles to sing, but fixing his gaze on the back of Henry's head. The captain's breath plumed in the moonlight, a steady, rhythmic cloud that betrayed none of the tension coiling in the trench below. He leaned an elbow on the sandbag, the wool of his sleeve brushing Henry's arm, warm and dry. "A fine night for carols," Hawley said. His tone was flat, a statement of meteorological fact rather than appreciation. One might almost forget the war was on, if one were prone to forgetfulness. "Their lines are quiet, sir." "Quiet?" Hawley tasted the word, rolling it around his mouth as if testing for poison. "Yes, quiet. A dangerous thing, quiet. It makes men feel safe. It makes them feel that the rules have suspended themselves along with the firing." He turned his head then, just enough for Henry to see the glint of wire-rimmed spectacles reflecting the snow, the eyes behind them hard and unyielding as flint. "High Command has issued specific instructions regarding such lulls, Williamson. Rumors of fraternization are circulating like influenza. They suggest that soldiers are forgetting which side of the wire they belong to." Henry swallowed. The saliva felt like ice water sliding down his gullet. "We haven't crossed, sir." "Not yet." Hawley pushed himself off the sandbag, straightening his tunic with a sharp tug that snapped the fabric. "But the intention is the precursor to the act. You are a writer, are you not? You observe things. You note the color of the sky, the habits of birds, the way the light falls on a hedge. You should understand that some observations are best left unrecorded. Some sights are not for the home front. Some sights are certainly not for the censors." Stepped closer, his voice dropping to a murmur that only Henry could hear, a private thread of steel woven into the public silence. If a man were to step out there into that moonlight to shake hands with the enemy, he would not be hailed as a diplomat. He would be court-martialed, shot at dawn. The King's regulations do not account for Christmas spirit, Private. They account for discipline. And discipline is the only thing keeping us from sliding back into the barbarism those fellows represent. Hawley gestured vaguely towards the singing Germans, a dismissive flick of a gloved hand. "They are Huns, they are the enemy. Whatever song they sing, whatever face they wear in the daylight, they are the enemy. Do not let the cold addle your brain into thinking otherwise. Sympathy is a luxury we cannot afford. It gets men killed. It gets battalions wiped out." The song swelled, a chorus of 20 voices now, rich and harmonious, filling the cratered valley with a sound so profoundly human it made Henry's chest ache. It was a sound of parlors and hearths, of families gathered around pianos in Leipzig or Dresden, utterly divorced from the rotting corpses buried in the snow 10 yards away. It demanded a response. It demanded recognition. "And if they come forward, sir?" Henry asked. The question slipped out before he could check it, driven by a need to understand the boundary line Hawley was drawing in the snow. Hawley stiffened. For a second, the mask of the dutiful officer slipped, revealing a flash of something weary, something that looked suspiciously like envy for the freedom of the men below. Then it was gone, replaced by the iron discipline of the London Rifle Brigade. "Then you hold your fire until I give the order," Hawley said, his voice cracking like a whip. "And you pray that I do not have to order you to shoot men who are singing to your mothers. But make no mistake, Williamson, if they cross that line with intent, you will shoot, or I will shoot you for mutiny. Is that clear?" "Clear, sir." "Good." Hawley adjusted his scarf, pulling the wool tight against his throat. "Stay at your post, watch the wire, but do not cross it. Not for tobacco, not for songs, not for anything. The truce ends when I say it ends. Until then, you are a soldier of the king, act like one." He lingered for a moment, listening to the final notes of the verse hang in the frozen air, his jaw working as if chewing on a bitter pill. Then he turned on his heel, his boots crunching heavily as he moved back down the communication trench towards the dugout, leaving Henry alone with the moonlight and the music. Silence he left behind was heavier than before, charged with the potential for violence. Henry gripped the sandbag until his knuckles turned white, the cold seeping through the leather of his gloves, numbing his fingers. Below him, the singing continued, oblivious to the threat hanging in the air, a fragile bubble of humanity floating in a sea of death. He looked down at his own hands, then out at the figures in the grey coats. They were waving now, tentative gestures, hands rising above the parapet like white flags. Arthur climbed up beside him, moving with the silence of a cat. He did not speak, merely following Henry's gaze to the middle ground where a single figure had stepped out, unarmed, walking slowly towards the British line. "He's coming," Arthur whispered. His voice was tight, stripped of emotion. "What do we do?" Henry looked at the approaching man, then back towards the dark mouth of the dugout where Hawley waited. The order was clear. The consequence was absolute. Yet the man in the grey coat kept walking, his hands open, his face upturned to the moon, singing a song that Henry knew every word of. "We wait," Henry said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and detached. "We wait and see if he stops." The figure took another step, then another. The snow crunched under his boots, a sound loud enough to hear clearly across the 20 yards of no man's land. He stopped 10 yards from the wire, raising a hand in greeting, a small, dark object glinting in his palm. "Tobacco," Arthur said. He let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh or a sob. "He's bringing bloody tobacco." Henry felt the pull again, stronger this time, a physical yank on his ribcage that threatened to drag him over the sandbags and out into the open. The rules of the trench, the orders of high command, the threat of the firing squatter, they all seemed to dissolve in the face of that offered packet, that simple, human gesture of sharing. "Harry," Arthur warned, his hand tightening on his rifle, "don't." But Henry was already moving, his body acting before his mind could formulate the disobedience. He swung a leg over the parapet, the frozen mud slick under his boot, and dropped down into the cratered slope, sliding towards the wire, towards the voice, towards the impossible. The drop hit him first in the knees, a sharp, biting cold that seized the joint and locked it stiff. Then the breath. It hung before his face, a solid white cloud that refused to dissipate, clinging to the wool of his scarf like frozen moss. Henry scrambled down the slope, the frozen clay tearing at the elbows of his tunic, scraping the skin raw beneath the fabric. He did not think about the court-martial. He did not think about Hawley's threat, the promise of a firing squad at dawn, the neat row of grav that waited for mutineers behind the lines at Ploegsteert. Those thoughts belonged to the trench, to the world of sandbags and regulations, and the rigid spine of the London Rifle Brigade. Down here, in the cratered bowl between the armies, there was only the crunch of his own boots and the singing. The Saxon stood 10 yards off, a grey shape against the white snow, motionless now, his hand still raised. The packet of tobacco glinted dull brown in the moonlight, a small, insignificant thing that somehow held more weight than the artillery battery pounding the horizon miles to the north. "Halt," Arthur hissed from above. The voice was thin, stretched tight by the wind. "Harry, for God's sake, halt." Henry ignored him. He kept moving, one slow step after another, testing the ground before committing his weight. The mud here was different. It was not the sucking, liquid clay of the fire trench, but a hard, unforgiving crust that cracked under his sole, hiding the soft death traps beneath. A misstep meant a broken ankle, or worse. It meant sinking into the black water below the freeze line, trapped in the dark with the rats and the unburied dead of November. He stopped 5 yards from the German. Close up, the man was younger than Henry had imagined. No beard, just a patch of rough stubble on a chin that trembled slightly. His eyes were wide, fixed on Henry's rifle, then flicking up to his face, searching for hatred and finding only a similar bewildered exhaustion. The uniform was ill-fitting, the collar too large, gaping open to reveal a strip of grey flannel shirt that looked thin against the biting air. "You sing," Henry said. The words came out flat, stripped of accent, sounding strange in the vast, open silence of the valley. "You sing still knacked." The German blinked. He lowered his hands slowly, keeping the palm visible, and then tucked the tobacco packet into the breast pocket of his tunic, patting it as if to ensure it was safe. "We know it," the German said. His English was heavy, clipped, the vowels rounded and soft. "My mother, she teaches in Leipzig." He tapped his own chest. "Leipzig." Henry nodded. He knew Leipzig. He had read of the Gewandhaus, the great concert hall where Mendelssohn had conducted. The image clashed violently with the reality, the barbed wire snagging on the man's puttees, the smell of cordite that seemed to rise from the snow itself, the way the man's breath plumed in the air just as Hawley's had done minutes before. "I am Henry," he said. He did not offer his rank. Ranks did not matter here. In this neutral ground, they were just 2 men standing in the freezing mud, defying the geometry of war that demanded they kill each other. "Karl," the German replied. He took a half-step forward. The snow crunched loudly, a gunshot sound in the stillness. "You have cigarettes." Henry froze. His hand drifted instinctively to his tunic pocket, where the half-empty pack of Woodbines lay crushed against his ribs. To give them was to admit a shared humanity, to acknowledge that the man opposite was not a Hun or a Bosch or a target for the Lewis gun, but a son who missed his mother, a clerk from Leipzig who taught his children carols. It was treason. It was the simplest thing in the world. Behind him, up on the parapet, Arthur shifted. The scrape of a boot on frozen earth sounded like a thunderclap. "Harry," Arthur called, his voice low, urgent. "Get back. Hawley's got the glasses. He's watching." Henry didn't turn. He kept his eyes on Karl. The German's face had tightened, the momentary relaxation gone, replaced by a flicker of fear. He understood the dynamic now. He saw the British soldier tensing, heard the warning from the shadows. The magic of the song was fraying, unraveling under the weight of the machinery that governed their lives. "I have them," Henry said. He pulled the pack out. The cardboard was soft, damp from his body heat. He held it out, arm extended, bridging the gap between the lines. Karl hesitated. He looked at the offering, then up at the dark line of the British trench, then back at Henry. His hand shook as he reached out. Their fingers brushed, cold and numb, grazing each other for a fraction of a second before the tobacco changed hands. It was a transfer of contraband, a transaction more significant than any order issued from high command. "Dank," Karl whispered. He shoved the packet inside his tunic, buttoning the flap quickly as if hiding a stolen jewel. You go now before they shoot." "They won't," Henry said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Not yet." "They will," Karl insisted. He stepped back, retreating into the safety of the shadows cast by the craters. "Tomorrow, the officers come, they say no more, always the same. First the singing, then the orders, then the shells." He gestured vaguely towards the east, where the sky was beginning to lighten, a pale, sickly gray bleeding into the black. "Morning brings the guns, you know this." Henry did know it. He had seen the cycles of the war, the way mercy was rationed out in brief, stolen moments before the bureaucracy of death reasserted itself. The ink in his pen had frozen because the world was too cold for fluid thought, for gentle words. Here in the open, the cold was absolute. "I will write," Henry said suddenly. The impulse seized him, irrational and desperate. I will write to my sister. I will tell her about this, about the song, about you." Carl shook his head, a sad, knowing smile touching his lips. "No," he said softly, "do not write the paper. It burns. The black pencil, yes. They take the truth away. You keep it here." He tapped his own temple, then pointed to Henry's chest. "Inside, that is the only place it stays safe." A whistle blew from the German line, sharp, piercing, cutting through the fragile quiet. It was not a signal of attack, but a recall. The moment was over. The window was closing, slamming shut with the force of a steel door. Carl turned. He raised a hand in a final, clumsy salute, not military but personal, a wave of acknowledgement between two strangers who would likely never meet again unless it was to kill one another. Then he turned and began to walk back towards his own wire, his steps quickening, hurrying to regain the safety of the enemy line before the dawn fully broke and the rules of the world reasserted their dominion. Henry stood alone in the crater. The tobacco packet was gone, but the warmth of the exchange lingered on his fingertips, a phantom sensation against the biting wind. He looked down at his own hands, empty now, stained with the mud of no man's land. "Harry," Arthur's voice was a shriek this time, stripped of all restraint. "Get back, move." Henry turned. He began the climb back up the slope, his boots slipping on the frozen crust, tearing at the earth with his fingers to find purchase. The parapet loomed above him, a dark ridge against the paling sky. He could see Arthur's face peering over the top, pale and tight with fear. Beyond him, in the shadow of the dugout entrance, a figure stood watching, Hawley. The captain's silhouette was rigid, unmoving, a statue of judgment carved from the night. Henry hauled himself over the sandbags, dropping heavily into the trench beside Arthur. The clay of the floor was slick, smelling of wet wool and stale tobacco. He brushed the snow from his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged the air between them. "You bloody fool," Arthur whispered, grabbing Henry's arm, his grip bruising. "You absolute bloody fool. He saw you. Hawley saw the whole thing." Henry looked towards the dugout. The captain was still there, watching them. He did not move, did not shout, did not reach for his revolver. He simply stood in the shadows, his face obscured by the brim of his cap, waiting. The silence from the officer was worse than any shout, heavier than the artillery barrage that would surely come with the sunrise. "He knew," Henry said, his voice trembling slightly. "Carl knew they would stop it. He said the morning brings the guns." Arthur released his arm, shaking his head as he picked up his rifle, checking the bolt with frantic, jerky movements. "Then we'd best be ready, hadn't we? Because if Hawley doesn't shoot you for stepping out, the Huns certainly will when the sun comes up. They'll have their orders too." Henry reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the notebook, the pages blank where the description of the bird life should have been, blank where the account of the carol should have sat. The ink was frozen solid inside the pen, a block of ice that would not flow no matter how much he warmed it against his skin. Some things, it seemed, could not be written. They could only be carried, heavy and silent, inside the chest, until the weight of them broke something vital and unseen. He looked out over the parapet, towards the east. The sky was turning a bruised purple, the first light of dawn bleeding over the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a single lark began to sing, a fragile, trembling note that hung in the freezing air for a second before being swallowed by the rumble of a heavy gun coming into position. The truce was over. The mud held the print of his boot, a perfect frozen mold that cracked as he lifted his foot, sounding like a dry bone snapping under a heavy heel. Silence. Not the waiting silence of a held breath before a volley, nor the tense quiet of a listening post straining for the crawl of a patrol, but a vast, hollow absence where the war used to be. Henry stepped over the parapet, his ribs tight against the wool of his tunic, expecting the crack of a Mauser or the thud of a sniper's bullet to punch through his lung. Nothing came. The frost had glazed the barbed wire in front of the German line, turning the cruel, tangled spikes into a necklace of diamonds that caught the pale, watery light of the Christmas morning sun. It was beautiful, terrifyingly so. "Keep your hands where they can see 'em, Harry," Arthur murmured, his voice low and rough, stripped of its usual London bite. "Don't look like you're reaching for a Webley." "I'm not," Henry said, though his fingers twitched near his pocket, instinctively seeking the notebook that sat useless and frozen against his hip. "I'm just walking." They moved away from the British trench, two small figures venturing into the grey expanse that had been a killing ground for 6 weeks. The ground was hard, ironclad by the freeze, offering a purchase they had not known for months. Before this, the clay had been a sucking mouth, swallowing boots and men alike, but now it rang under their hobnailed soles. Crunch, crunch. The sound was obscene in the vacuum, loud as a shout, marking their progress across the shell craters that pocked the landscape like smallpox scars. Henry watched a lark, singular and mad, burst from a clump of frozen grass near a shattered tree stump. It flew straight up, ignoring the two armies, ignoring the logic of survival, and poured out a cascade of song that seemed to mock the stillness below. "Look at the wire," Henry said, stopping to point at a strand sagging between two iron posts. "It's turned to glass." Arthur didn't look. His eyes were fixed on the grey line of the German trench, 50 yards ahead, where heads were beginning to appear over the parapet. "Glass cuts, Henry, don't forget that." "It's just ice, Artie, just water." "It's the same thing that freezes the blood in your veins if you lie out here too long. Keep moving." They closed the distance. The Saxons were climbing out now, not with rifles raised, but with hands open, palms forward, showing the empty air. Some wore caps pulled low against the cold, others had bare heads, their hair plastered flat. Henry felt a strange detachment, as if his soul had floated up to join the lark, looking down on two groups of boys meeting in a field. There was no hate in the air. The hatred belonged to the newspapers in London, to the generals in their chateaux, to the politicians who drew lines on maps. Here, in the mud, there was only the shared, biting cold and the smell of damp earth. A man stepped forward from the German group. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face reddened by the wind and a smear of flour on his cheek that looked absurdly domestic against the grey uniform. He held out a packet wrapped in brown paper. "Tabak," the man said. His voice was deep, resonant. "For you." Henry stopped 3 paces away. He could see the chapped skin around the man's lips, the same raw cracks that plagued Fred, Sox Miller, back in the dugout. He could smell the man, too, not the stench of rot or cordite, but the faint, yeasty scent of bread and the sharp tang of cheap tobacco. "Thank you," Henry said. He fumbled in his own pocket, pulling out a tin of bully beef and a handful of cigarettes he had saved from the last ration issue. "Cigarettes, for you." The exchange was clumsy, fingers brushing in the cold air, passing the tokens of peace. The German took the cigarettes with a nod of gratitude, breaking one immediately and placing it between his lips. He offered a light, shielding the match with a cupped hand. The smoke drifted up, a thin blue ribbon that mingled with their breath. "I am Karl," the man said, tapping his chest. "BA tilde currency sign Seeker, Baker, Dresden." Henry replied, pointing to himself. Then he gestured to Arthur, who stood rigid at his shoulder, his hand still hovering near his belt, though his bayonet remained sheathed. "Arthur, London." "London," Karl repeated, the words sounding foreign and heavy on his tongue. He smiled, and for a second, the exhaustion in his eyes vanished, replaced by a boyish eagerness. "Football, you play." Arthur blinked, the tension in his shoulders dropped an inch. "Football." "Ja, fussball." Karl made a kicking motion with his boot, scuffing the frozen mud. He pointed to a space between the lines where the ground was flattest, free of craters and wire. "Match, today." A laugh bubbled up in Arthur's throat, a sound so rare and unexpected that Henry stared at him. It was a short, barking noise, devoid of humor but full of relief. "You want a game here, in this?" "Why not?" Karl shrugged, spreading his arms wide to encompass the field of death. "No officers, no guns, just boots and ball." Arthur looked at Henry, and for the first time in months, the mask of the stoic soldier slipped completely, his eyes crinkled at the corners. "We haven't got a ball, mate." Karl reached behind his back and produced a ragged sphere of leather, stitched together with twine, battered and misshapen but whole. He tossed it to Arthur. The Londoner caught it instinctively, weighing it in his hands. "We use this," Karl said. "Goal posts there, and there." He pointed to 2 broken tree stumps marking the boundaries of their neutral ground. Arthur looked down at the ball, then back at the line of German soldiers who were now cheering softly, a low rumble of approval that vibrated in the cold air. He looked at Henry, and the ghost of a grin touched his lips. "Well," Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly, "suppose we can't let them beat us on our own soil, can we?" "No," Henry agreed, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. "Suppose not." For an hour, the war did not exist. There was only the thud of the leather ball, the crunch of boots on frost, and the shouted instructions in broken English and fractured German. Henry ran until his lungs burned, chasing the ball alongside a Saxon corporal who smelled of soap and sweat. They fell together into the mud, laughing as they scrambled for possession, their uniforms staining with the same earth. Arthur played with a fierce, quiet intensity, dribbling past two Germans with a skill Henry had never seen him display in the trench. When he scored, kicking the ball between the stumps, the roar that went up from both sides was indistinguishable. It was a single voice, triumphant and human. Henry paused to catch his breath, leaning against a shattered sapling. He watched Arthur standing in the center of the makeshift pitch, surrounded by enemies who were clapping him on the back. The sight was surreal, a painting of a world that might have been if not for the maps and the orders. He wanted to memorize it, the way the light hit the frost on Arthur's eyelashes, the sound of the baker from Dresden shouting, "Gut, gut," as he wiped mud from his forehead, the sheer, impossible normalcy of it. But the light was failing. The sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the no-man's land. The laughter began to die down, replaced by a nervous shuffling. From the British trench, a whistle blew, sharp, angry. Then another from the German line. The spell broke. The men stopped. They looked at their trenches, then at each other, the reality of the situation crashing back down with the weight of a falling shell. The officers were shouting now, their voices carrying clearly in the still air, ordering a return to positions. Karl walked over to Henry. He looked tired again, the baker's apron replaced by the uniform of the Kaiser. He held out a hand. Henry took it. The grip was firm, warm. "Go now," Karl said softly, "before the sun goes down, before the others, before they remember." "Yes," Henry said. His throat felt tight. "Thank you, Karl." "Keep the tobacco, smoke it when it is dark." Karl turned and began to walk back towards his line, his head down. The other Germans followed, casting backward glances, waving hesitant hands. Arthur walked back to Henry, kicking the ragged ball once more before leaving it in the center of the field, a monument to the afternoon. They walked back to the British trench in silence. The frost seemed harder now, the wire less like jewels and more like traps. As they reached the parapet, Henry scrambled up, his hands grabbing the sandbags. "Quickly," Arthur hissed, pulling him down. They dropped into the trench. The air here was thick with the smell of wet wool and stew, a stark contrast to the crisp cleanliness of the field. But before Henry could straighten his tunic, a single rifle shot cracked from the British line. Crack! The bullet sparked off the iron plating of a dugout roof, inches from Henry's head. Dust rained down into his hair. "Get down," Sergeant Major Evans roared, his face purple with rage. "Get down, you bloody fools! Who gave you permission to fraternize? Who told you could play games with the bloody Huns?" Henry crouched against the mud wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Arthur, who was staring at the ground, his face unreadable. The magic was gone. The war had returned, sharper and more vicious for the brief respite. Later, in the flickering light of a tallow candle, Henry sat on his upturned ration box. He uncapped his fountain pen, holding it in his fist to warm the ink, trying to melt the frozen block inside the nib. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. The white paper stared back at him, demanding an account. "Dear Cicely," he began, the pen scratching softly. "Christmas Day has passed quietly." He stopped. The words looked like lies. He thought of Karl's flour-dusted cheek, of Arthur's laugh, of the ball rolling on the frozen mud. He thought of Captain Hawley's shadow in the dugout, the warning shot that had sparked off the iron, the order that would surely come down the line tomorrow, forbidding any mention of this day. Henry dipped the pen again, but the ink refused to flow. It sat in the nib, a solid black jewel. He pressed harder, tearing the paper. He could not write it. If he wrote the truth, the censor would black it out with tar, or worse, Hawley would read it and court-martial them all. If he wrote the lie, he betrayed the memory of the hour. He capped the pen with a sharp click. The sound echoed in the small dugout, final and absolute. He closed the notebook and shoved it into his tunic pocket next to the frozen earth of no man's land that clung to his boots. Some things, he realized, were too heavy for the post. They would have to stay here, buried in the mud, with the rest of the dead. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the wire, sounding eerily like a flute playing a tune he couldn't quite remember. The candle guttered. A draft from the ventilation shaft, cold as a grave breath, flattened the flame until it was a blue sliver clinging to the wick, then let it surge back up, yellow and greedy. "Leave it," Arthur said. He didn't look up from his boots. He was scraping mud from the hobnails with the back of his bayonet, the steel ringing softly against the leather. Scrape, ring, scrape. Hawley's doing the rounds. If he sees a light, he'll have us on charge before breakfast. "He can't see in here," Henry muttered. He rubbed his thumb over the tear in the paper, feeling the rough edge where the nib had snagged. "And I haven't finished." "You haven't started." Arthur stopped scraping. He held the blade up, inspecting the edge in the dim light. "You've made a hole. That's not writing, that's violence." Henry capped the pen. The click sounded like a bone snapping. He pressed the metal cylinder into his palm, feeling the residual chill of the ink inside, a frozen blockage that matched the knot in his stomach. The words "Christmas Day has passed" quietly sat on the page, a monument to deceit. They were safe words, sanitized, the kind of words a mother in Broccoli could read over her morning toast without spilling her tea. They spoke of roast goose and church bells, not of a Saxon baker named Carl handing over a string of raw sausages in exchange for a tin of bulldog tobacco. They did not speak of the football, or the laugh that had cracked Arthur's face open, or the way the frost had turned the barbed wire into a necklace of diamonds before the sun went down. To write the truth was to invite the censor's black pencil. To write the lie was to poison the well between them. "So what do I say?" Henry asked. His voice sounded thin in the cramped dugout, swallowed by the damp earth walls. "She asks if we are safe. She asks if we are warm. If I tell her we played football with the men we are supposed to kill tomorrow, she'll think I've gone mad. Or worse, she'll think it's a trick." Arthur shoved the bayonet back into its scabbard with a sharp shunk. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands dangling between his legs. The tallow light carved deep hollows under his eyes, making him look older than his 24 years, ancient in the way of things that have seen too much winter. "Tell her you're warm," Arthur said. "It's not entirely a lie. The sausages were hot when we ate them." "They were raw, Arthur." Near enough, a ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone before it could take hold. "And tell her you're safe, for tonight. That's the only truth that matters to Alice. The rest is just noise, static on the line." Henry picked up the notebook again. The paper felt flimsy, inadequate to hold the weight of the afternoon. He remembered the texture of Carl's hand, rough with flour and cold, the smell of yeast that had clung to his uniform despite the trench mud. He remembered the way the German soldiers had huddled together, their faces pale and thin, identical to the faces of the men in the platoon next door. There had been no hate in their eyes. Only a desperate, shared exhaustion, a recognition that they were all meat for the same grinder. "Dear Cicely," he wrote again, the pen moving slowly now, fighting the viscosity of the cold ink. "We had a quiet day. The weather has turned very cold and the ground is hard as iron. We managed to get a hot meal, which was a mercy." He paused. The lie tasted like ash. "Arthur is well. He sends his love." That part was true. Arthur was here, alive, breathing the same stale air thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and burning fat. But for how long? The warning shot still rang in Henry's ears, a sharp reminder that the truce was a bubble that had burst, leaving only the jagged edges of reality. Tomorrow the orders would come down, resume hostilities. The men who had shared tobacco would be targets again. The baker from Dresden would be a silhouette in the sights of a rifle. "Do you think they'll shoot?" Henry asked. He didn't look at Arthur. He watched the shadow of the candle flame dance on the earth wall, stretching and shrinking like a living thing. "Tomorrow, when we go over." Arthur reached out and took the tobacco pouch from his pocket. It was the one Carl had given him, a crude thing made of grey cloth, smelling faintly of foreign leaf. He rolled it between his fingers, the fabric making a soft, whispering sound. "They'll shoot," Arthur said, "because they're told to, and we'll shoot because we're told to." He looked up, his gaze steady, devoid of the wonder that had lit his face on the frozen pitch. "That's the job, Henry. We don't get to choose when the music stops." But we shook their hands. "And tomorrow we'll put bullets in their chests." Arthur's voice was flat, stripped of emotion. "Don't make it bigger than it is. It's just geography. Today we stood in the middle. Tomorrow we stay on our side. Nothing changes except the map." Henry stared at him. The stoicism was a shield, he knew, armor plating welded over whatever soft human thing lay beneath. Arthur had laughed today. He had run and kicked a ball and shouted in broken German. That boy was still in there, buried under the uniform and the orders, but he was retreating, digging himself deeper into the trenches of duty. "It changes something," Henry insisted. He pressed the pen to the paper again, needing to capture it, to fix the moment before it dissolved completely. "It has to." "Does it?" Arthur stood up, stretching his back until his spine cracked. He tucked the tobacco pouch away, safe against his heart. "Ask the dead if it matters. Ask the ones from July. Did their handshakes save them?" He moved to the entrance of the dugout, peering out into the darkness of the trench. The wind outside had picked up, whistling through the barbed wire, a high, mournful sound that set Henry's teeth on edge. It sounded like a flute, yes, but a flute played by a ghost. "Put the book away, Henry," Arthur said, his back still turned. "Hawley's coming. I can hear his boots." Henry hesitated. The page was half full of lies, half empty of truth, a fragmented record of a day that never happened, according to the high command. He looked at the words "quiet day." They mocked him. It had been the loudest day of his life, filled with the roar of laughter and the crash of a worldview shattering. He closed the notebook. The leather cover was cold, slick with the moisture of the trench. He slid it into his tunic pocket, feeling the hard edge of the pen case pressing against his ribs. A secret, a contraband memory. "Right," Henry said. He blew out the candle. Darkness swallowed the dugout instantly, thick and absolute. The smell of the extinguished wick hung in the air, acrid and sharp. In the blackness, Henry could hear Arthur breathing, steady and rhythmic, and further down the line, the murmur of other voices, the clatter of mess tins, the endless shifting slide of mud. "Keep your head down," Arthur whispered from the shadows. "Tomorrow's a long day." Henry nodded, though Arthur couldn't see it. He sat still in the dark, his hand resting on the pocket where the notebook lay. He could feel the warmth of his own body seeping into the paper, a futile attempt to thaw the frozen ink, to melt the silence that was already building between this trench and the brick house in Brockley. Footsteps approached, heavy, authoritative boots crunching on the duckboards. Captain Hawley's voice drifted down the line, crisp and commanding, ordering sentries to be alert, reminding men of their duties, erasing the memory of the football match with the cold efficiency of regulation. Henry held his breath. He waited for the beam of a torch to sweep across the dugout entrance, for the officer's shadow to fall across them. He waited for the war to reclaim them completely. But in his pocket, the notebook remained, a small, hard lump of truth in a world of lies, waiting for a post that would never carry it home. The footsteps stopped right outside their dugout. "Emery Williamson," Hawley's voice cut through the dark, sharp as a razor. "Are you awake?" Arthur's voice came from the black, low and devoid of sleep. He did not move to light a match, knowing the rule, knowing that in this new year a spark was a confession. Hawley stepped into the dugout, the leather of his Sam Brown belt creaking under the weight of a revolver that had not been drawn during the singing. The smell of him arrived first, stiff collar starch, expensive shaving soap, and the cold, wet clay of the parapet clinging to his puttees. He filled the small space, a block of authority cutting through the fug of unwashed men. "Light," Hawley said, not a question, a command stripped of pleasantries. Arthur struck a lucifer. The flare hissed, blooming sudden and yellow against the earth walls, casting long, dancing shadows that made the dugout seem to shrink. Hawley's face emerged from the gloom, pale and sharp-boned, his eyes scanning the corner where Henry sat hunched over his knees. The beam of the electric torch in Hawley's hand swept past Arthur, jerked, and pinned Henry's chest. "Writing, Williamson." Henry flinched as the light blinded him, turning the world into a white void before resolving back into the muddy confines of the hole. He kept his hand inside his tunic, fingers clamped around the notebook like a thief holding stolen silver. "Just a line to my mother, sir, to say we are well." Hawley stepped closer, the mud on his boots squelching softly, a wet, sucking sound that echoed the trench itself. He leaned down, his face inches from Henry's, smelling of peppermint and stale tobacco. "We are well," Hawley repeated. The words hung in the cold air, flat and heavy. "Is that the official position of the platoon?" "It is the truth, sir." "The truth." Hawley straightened up, brushing a fleck of damp earth from his sleeve with a fastidious flick of his thumb. "The truth is a flexible commodity, Private. It stretches to fit the envelope. It shrinks to fit the censor's pencil." He paused, letting the silence expand until it pressed against their eardrums. "High Command has issued fresh instructions regarding the events of yesterday." Arthur shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning under his boot. "Sir." "The fraternization," Hawley said, the word dropping like a stone into a well. "It is to be treated as a lapse in discipline, a temporary aberration caused by fatigue and the holiday season. It did not happen. Do you understand me? There was no football. There were no exchanges of goods. There were no conversations with the enemy." Henry felt the notebook burn against his ribs. The leather cover seemed to pulse with the heat of the lie he was carrying. He thought of Karl, the baker from Dresden, his hands red and chapped, passing a sausage wrapped in newspaper. He thought of the way the man's eyes had crinkled when Arthur mimed a goal, a moment of pure, unguarded joy that now felt like a crime. "But sir," Henry started, the words slipping out before he could cage them. "The men saw, the Saxons saw, we shook hands." Hawley's head snapped around. The torch beam swung wildly, catching the edge of a mess tin, flashing blind white, before settling back on Henry's face. The officer's expression had hardened, the mask of the gentleman soldier slipping to reveal the iron beneath. "What you saw, Williamson, was a breakdown in order. What you remember is irrelevant. What you write," he tapped the pocket where the notebook hid, "is subject to the Defense of the Realm Act. Any mention of social intercourse with the enemy will be struck out. Any letter containing such references will be confiscated. And the writer," he leaned in again, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more threat than a shout, "will be relieved of his duties, permanently." The air in the dugout grew thick, suffocating. The smell of the extinguished candle wick mixed with the damp rot of the sandbags, creating a nausea that rose in Henry's throat. He looked at Arthur, seeking an anchor, but Arthur was staring at the floor, his jaw set in a line so rigid it looked painful. "We understand, sir," Arthur said. His voice was empty, scrubbed clean of the laughter from the frozen pitch. "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't." Hawley straightened his tunic, pulling the fabric down over his hips. "The truce is over. The war has resumed. Treat the wire ahead as hostile territory. Any man crossing it without orders will be shot, by his own officers, if necessary." He turned to leave, the movement sharp and efficient. At the entrance, he paused, looking back into the gloom where the two Londoners sat huddled in their coats. "Finish your letters, Williamson. Make them cheerful. Your mother worries." The footsteps receded, crunching away down the communication trench, fading into the distant rumble of a supply wagon and the low murmur of sentries changing guard. The darkness rushed back in to fill the space Hawley had occupied, heavier than before, pressing down on their chests. Arthur struck another match. The flame trembled in the draught, casting a sickly yellow glow on his face. He looked older than he had this morning. The lines around his mouth were deeper, etched by a sudden, weary resignation. "Cheerful," Arthur muttered. He lit the stub of a cigarette, the cherry glowing bright orange in the dark. He took a long drag, the smoke curling up towards the low roof of the dugout. "How do you write cheerful when you know you'll be killing the man who gave you tobacco tomorrow?" Henry pulled the notebook from his pocket. The leather was damp with his sweat. He opened it to the page where he had written "Quiet Day." The ink had dried into a dull, grey smear. He looked at the blank space below, the white paper mocking him, demanding words that did not exist. He dipped the pen into the inkwell. The fluid was sluggish, thick with cold, resisting the nib. He pressed down, forcing the ink to flow, but all that came out was a blot, a dark, spreading stain that looked like a wound. "I can't," Henry whispered. The word barely made a sound. Arthur exhaled a plume of smoke, watching it dissipate into the shadows. "Then don't. Write about the weather, write about the food, write about anything but the truth." "But she'll know." "She won't." Arthur crushed the cigarette out on the sole of his boot, grinding it until the ember died. "They never know, not until the telegram comes, and even then they don't really know, they just know we aren't coming back." Henry stared at the blot on the page. It spread slowly, eating into the fibers of the paper, obscuring the words "Arthur is well." He tried to write over it, to force a sentence through the damage, but the pen snagged on the wet pulp, tearing a jagged hole right through the center of the page. A tear in the paper, a tear in the story. He closed the book abruptly, the sound like a gunshot in the small space. He shoved it back into his pocket, feeling the hard edges dig into his thigh. The lie sat there now, solid and real, heavier than the truth ever could be. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the wire, a high, thin note that sounded nothing like a flute and nothing like a ghost. It sounded like a warning. Somewhere down the line, a rifle bolt clicked home. The sharp, metallic snap echoed off the earth walls, final and absolute. Henry looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at the floor. Neither of them moved to pick up a pen again. The candle flickered, dipped, and went out. The scratch of graphite on paper sounded like a boot dragging through gravel, sharp, dry, unforgiving. Henry sat on the inverted ration box, his knees drawn up to support the notebook resting on his thighs. The dugout air hung heavy, thick with the scent of burnt matchsticks and the sour, fungal damp of earth walls that sweated continuously. He did not look up when the shadow fell across the page, blocking the flicker of the tallow candle. He knew the stance. Stiff spine, hands clasped behind the back, the particular stillness of an officer who holds the power to erase. "Let us see it, Williamson." The voice belonged to the battalion censor, a lieutenant whose name Henry had never caught, though he knew the man's fingers by heart. They were stained permanently blue-black, the cuticles ragged from chewing or picking at the ink. He held a thick carpenter's pencil, the wood peeled back to expose a broad, chisel-like blade. Henry slid the notebook across his knees. The paper crinkled, damp from the condensation rising off the clay floor. He watched the officer's hands. They did not tremble. They moved with the efficient, mechanical precision of a machine operator feeding stock into a press. The lieutenant read. His eyes tracked the lines without blinking, absorbing the description of the frozen football, the Saxon baritone singing still knacked, the exchange of tobacco across the frost-hardened ruts. Henry's throat tightened. He had written it all down, every handshake, every laugh that had sounded human instead of desperate. He had thought the paper would carry it home to Broccoli, to Alice, so she might know her son had not entirely lost his soul to the mud. The pencil hovered. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic thump of a Minenwerfer landing a mile east, a dull pressure against the eardrums like a change in weather. Then the blade touched the page. It did not scratch this time, it smeared. A thick, tar-like stroke obliterated the line about the German offering a cigarette. The graphite dug into the fiber, tearing the surface, leaving a glossy black scar that soaked into the next page beneath. "Sir," Henry said, the word slipped out before he could check it. "That is the truth of it." The lieutenant did not look up. He drew another line. This one crossed out the paragraph describing the enemy's face, young and beardless, identical to the boy who served tea in the Broccoli parlor. "The truth is what passes the post, private, nothing more. But they will see the gaps. Let them." The pencil moved faster now, aggressive, hacking through the narrative. Handshake, black, shared bread, black, peace, a heavy, jagged stroke that nearly ripped the paper in two. Henry flinched as if the lead were a bayonet driving into his own chest. It was a violation deeper than the cold seeping through his puttees. They could take his warmth, his sleep, his blood. To take the memory, to edit the witness, was to kill the thing twice. Arthur sat on the opposite bunk, sharpening a knife against the sole of his boot. He watched the sensor work, his expression flat, unreadable. He did not intervene. He knew the futility of it, the way words dissolved against authority like sugar in rain. The lieutenant closed the notebook. The cover was smeared now, graphite dust coating the leather where his palm had rested. He tossed it back onto Henry's lap. The weight of it felt wrong. Lighter, emptied out. "Rewrite the missing sections," the officer said. He wiped his fingers on a rag, leaving fresh smudges on the cloth. "Describe the weather. Mention the ration status. Keep it cheerful. Your mother does not need to know you are living among ghosts. She knows I am here. She knows you are in France. There is a difference." The lieutenant turned to the dugout entrance, his silhouette framed against the grey slurry of the trench outside. "Next time, do not write what cannot be printed. It wastes my time and ink." He stepped out into the communication trench. The mud sucked at his boots with a wet, sucking sound, slow and greedy, before releasing him with a pop. Henry stared at the notebook. The black bars stared back. They were not merely ink, they were walls. Each stroke built a barrier between Broccoli and Ploegsteert, ensuring that Alice would read of frost and rations while the reality of the handshake rotted in the dark. He ran a finger over the smeared line where the German's name had been. The graphite came away on his fingertip, a dirty mark that would not wash off. "Cheerful," Arthur said. He tested the edge of his knife with his thumb, wincing as the steel caught on a callus. "How does one write cheerful about this?" He gestured with the blade at the dugout, the mud-caked walls, the candle guttering in the draught. "Tell her the rats are well fed. Tell her the mud has a lovely consistency." "I cannot write it again." Henry's voice was low, rough. "To write it again is to lie twice." "Then do not write it." Arthur resumed the sharpening motion. SHHH, SHHH, rhythmic, hypnotic. Leave the gaps, let her wonder. Silence speaks louder than the black pencil sometimes. Henry closed the book. He pressed his palm against the cover, feeling the indentation of the strokes beneath the leather. The truth was trapped inside, suffocated under layers of state-approved omission. He shoved the notebook into his breast pocket, the hard corner digging into his sternum. It would sit there, a lump of forbidden history, warming against his skin while the lie traveled home in the envelope. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried a new sound, distinct from the wind's whistle or the distant artillery. Boots, multiple pairs, marching in step. Not the sloppy drag of a ration party, but the crisp, deliberate strike of officers inspecting the line. Henry looked at Arthur. Arthur stopped sharpening. The knife hovered, poised above the boot leather. The footsteps stopped right outside their dugout. Mud crunched under a heavy heel. A shadow broader than the sensors fell across the entrance, blocking what little light remained from the trench flare. "Emery Williamson." The voice cut through the dark, sharp as a razor. "Captain Hawley." He did not wait for an invitation to enter. Hawley ducked under the beam. The dugout roof scraped his cap peak, shedding a cascade of dry clay onto his shoulders. He did not brush it off. He stood straight, occupying the narrow space until the air felt displaced, pressurized by his presence. The candle flame dipped, struggling against the draft of his entrance, then steadied, casting his shadow large against the earthen wall where it merged with the darker shapes of rifles stacked in the corner. He smelled of lavender soap and starch, clean linen pressed against skin that had not known mud for days. It was an olfactory assault, more violent than the shelling, reminding them of a world where collars remained stiff and hands remained soft. "Stand easy," Hawley said. His voice lacked the bark of the parade ground, replaced by a low, tired authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "I shan't keep you long. The cold bites enough without me adding to it." Arthur shifted his weight. The knife ceased its rhythmic SHHH against the leather. He rested the blade on his knee, edge turned inward, hands loose around the hilt, a gesture of peace or perhaps just fatigue. Henry kept his hands still on his knees. The notebook in his breast pocket felt hot, a cold tugged against his sternum. He feared the graphite might bleed through the wool, stain the tunic, reveal the contraband hidden beneath the buttoned flap. "General Headquarters has issued new directives," Hawley said. He looked at neither of them specifically, focusing instead on the candle flame, watching the wick char and curl. Effective immediately, the informal ceasefire is concluded. Any contact with the enemy line is strictly prohibited. Any soldier seen crossing the wire will be shot, by the enemy, ideally, if not, by their own officers. He lifted his gaze. It landed on Henry. The captain's eyes were pale, washed out by the dim light, but they held a sharpness that missed nothing. They tracked the rise and fall of Henry's chest, the tension in the shoulders, the way the left hand hovered near the pocket. Hawley knew, or he suspected. In the trenches, suspicion carried the same weight as proof. "Williamson," Hawley said. "So, you have a pen in that pocket. I saw the clip when you stood for the sensor earlier." Henry's throat tightened. He did not reach for the notebook. To touch it now would be confession. "Yes, sir, for correspondence." "Correspondence?" Hawley tested the word, rolling it around his mouth as if tasting something sour. "Ensure your correspondence reflects the current state of affairs. We are at war, not at a picnic. There are mothers reading those letters. They need to know their sons are fighting, not fraternizing with the Hun." "They know we are fighting," Henry said. The words slipped out before he could weigh them. "The mud tells them that, the wounds." Arthur stiffened. A warning tension ran through his frame. Hawley stepped closer. The lavender scent intensified, cloying against the smell of wet wool and human sweat. He leaned down, bringing his face within inches of Henry's. Henry could see the pores on the captain's nose, the faint tremor in the eyelid that spoke of sleepless nights and too much caffeine. "The mud is irrelevant," Hawley whispered. "The wounds are necessary, but the narrative is mine. Do you understand me? What leaves this trench leaves with my approval. If I see another paragraph about German choirs or shared tobacco, I will burn the letter, and I will burn the hand that wrote it." He straightened up. The moment of intimacy vanished, replaced by the rigid carapace of rank. He turned to Arthur. "Emery, ensure your section is ready for dawn. Noises off, bayonets fixed. If a head shows over the parapet without my order, I want it dropped. Clear." "Clear, sir," Arthur said. His voice was flat, devoid of the defiance Henry had just shown. He understood the game. Survival meant playing the part. "Good." Hawley adjusted his gloves, pulling the leather tight over his knuckles. "We resume shelling at 600. Heavy barrage on their front line. I suggest you keep your heads down. The debris from this one will be substantial." He turned to leave. At the entrance, he paused, silhouetted against the grey smear of the trench outside. "Oh, and Williamson. So, write to your mother, tell her you are well, tell her the weather is holding, tell her anything you like, so long as it keeps her calm, but do not tell her the truth. The truth is too heavy for broccoli to carry." Hawley stepped out. His boots crunched on the frost-hardened lip of the dugout, fading quickly into the ambient noise of the line. The candle flame surged upward, freed from the displacement of his body, then settled back into a steady, yellow burn. Henry exhaled. He had not realized he was holding his breath until his lungs burned. He slumped forward, elbows on knees, head hanging between his arms. The notebook pressed against his ribs, hard and unyielding. It felt heavier now, laden with the weight of the forbidden words Hawley had just outlawed. Arthur picked up the knife again. He resumed the sharpening motion. SHHH, SHHH. The sound was louder now, aggressive, slicing through the quiet. "He knows," Henry said. His voice sounded thin, scraped raw. "He suspects," Arthur corrected. He held the blade up to the candlelight, examining the edge for imperfections. "There is a difference. Suspicion allows you to live. Proof gets you shot against a wall. He told me to lie. He told you to survive." Arthur tested the edge against his thumb. A bead of blood welled, bright red against the calloused skin. He wiped it on his trouser leg, leaving a dark smear. "There is no honor in a dead letter, Henry. Write what he wants. Save the rest for later." "Later. When this is over, or when you are dead. Either way, the truth waits." Arthur sheathed the knife. The leather creaked, a dry, brittle sound. "Now, are you going to write to Alice or stare at the mud until it swallows you?" Henry reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed the leather cover of the notebook. It was warm from his body heat. He pulled it out and placed it on the small crate that served as a table. The black bars from the sensor stared up at him, ugly scars across the page. He opened his fountain pen. The ink inside was viscous, sluggish in the cold, requiring the warmth of his hand to flow. He dipped the nib. It hovered over the blank space below the censored lines. The paper waited, white and innocent, demanding a lie. Arthur blew out the candle. Darkness flooded the dugout, thick and absolute, save for the faint grey light filtering in from the trench flare outside. In the gloom, the scratch of the pen against the paper sounded like a rat gnawing at bone. Henry wrote the first word. It tasted like ash in his mouth. "Dearest Mother." The ink flowed, dark and permanent, binding him to the fiction Hawley demanded. He wrote of the weather. He wrote of the rations. He wrote of everything except the men who had sung across the frost. Each sentence built a wall between himself and Alice, brick by invisible brick. He filled the page with nothingness, knowing that in Brockley, the silence between the lines would scream louder than any artillery barrage. He reached the bottom of the page. The ink was running dry. He paused, pen hovering, waiting for the next thought to come. It did not. There was nothing left to say that was not a lie. Outside, a single rifle shot cracked the night. Sharp, final. Henry capped the pen. The click sounded like a lock engaging. The click of the cap echoed, a tiny final sound that seemed to swallow the rest of the dugout's air. Darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint, sickly grey wash of a flare drifting slowly down outside, casting long, dancing shadows against the clay walls that looked like grasping fingers. Henry sat still, the pen warm in his palm, a useless heat source now that the words had stopped flowing, leaving the page half full of polite fictions and half scarred by the censor's brutal, tar-like strokes. He could feel Arthur shifting beside him, the rustle of wool on wool loud in the quiet, a restless movement that spoke of a man who found stillness harder to bear than the shelling. "Finish it," Arthur said. His voice was low, a rough scrape in the gloom. "She'll worry more about the blank space than the lie." "There is nothing left to write." Henry stared at the paper, though he could barely see it. "How do I tell her the sky is clear when the air tastes of cordite and rot? How do I say we are safe when a single shot just proved we are not?" "You tell her the sun came up." Arthur struck a match, the sudden flare of sulfur sharp and chemical, illuminating his face for a heartbeat before he cupped his hand around the flame to light a fresh cigarette end he had scavenged from the floor. The glow revealed the tight set of his jaw, the way his eyes avoided the letter, focusing instead on the burning tip of the tobacco. "You tell her you have dry socks. You tell her the beef was hot. You give her the things she can hold in her hands, Henry. The rest is just noise. The rest is everything. The rest is dead men." Arthur took a long drag, the ember flaring bright orange, then fading as he exhaled a plume of smoke that curled upward, mixing with the damp air to form a grey haze that smelled of stale tobacco and despair. "Hawley's right in his way. Your mother doesn't need to know about the handshake. She doesn't need to picture you sharing a cigarette with a man who will try to put a bullet in your skull tomorrow. That image would keep her awake nights, far more than the mud ever could." Henry looked down at the letter again. The black bars seemed to pulse in the dim light, ugly wounds across the paper where the truth of the Saxon choir and the shared chocolate had lived just an hour before. He remembered the German's face, pale and young under the frost, the way his hands had shaken as he offered the tin, the humanity that had bridged the wire for a few stolen hours before the world turned back to iron and hate. Now that memory was contraband, a secret crime punishable by the erasure of ink and the threat of a firing squad. "She will know," Henry whispered. "She knows my hand. She knows when I am hiding something." "Then hide it better." Arthur flicked the ash from his cigarette, watching it fall to the mud floor where it hissed and died. "Write about the frost. Write about the way the breath hangs in the air. Write about anything but the men opposite. Make the silence sound like peace, not a held breath." Henry uncapped the pen again. The ink had cooled, thickening in the nib, and he had to press hard to force the flow, the metal scratching against the fiber of the paper with a sound that grated on his nerves. He stared at the blank space at the bottom of the page, the white expanse demanding to be filled, demanding a signature that would validate the lie. "The frost is heavy on the wire," he wrote, the letters cramped and jagged as he fought the stiffening ink. It catches the light of the flares and makes the whole world glitter, though the cold bites through the boots and settles in the bones. We had a quiet day, Mother, very quiet. The birds have gone, of course, but the silence is a comfort in its own way. A comfort, the word sat on the page, a monstrous falsehood that made his stomach turn. The silence was not a comfort, it was a trap, a pregnant pause before the next barrage, a held breath that could end in a scream at any second. But he wrote it anyway, forcing the pen to move, forcing the lie to take physical form on the paper that would travel back to Brockley, to the warm parlor where his mother would read it by the fire and believe her son was safe in the quiet. "And the rations?" Arthur asked. He was sharpening the pencil now, the blade slicing away thin curls of wood that fell onto his knee, a mundane, domestic action that clashed violently with the setting. "Did you mention the bully beef?" "I said it was hot." "Good lie." Arthur blew the wood shavings from his leg. "Better than saying it was frozen solid and tasted of tin. She'll imagine a stew, warmth in a bowl. That's enough for her." "It isn't enough for me." Henry pressed the nib harder, creating a small blot of ink that spread like a bruise on the paper. He had to stop, had to breathe, before the anger or the grief spilled out onto the page, in a way the censor could not fix, but his mother would certainly feel. "It feels like I am burying them all over again. Every word I don't write is another shovel of earth." "Then don't think of it as burying." Arthur's voice softened, just a fraction, losing some of its edge. "Think of it as keeping them safe. If you write the truth, they take the letter, they burn it. Then the memory is gone completely, Henry, gone from the world. This way the letter gets through. The black bars are there, yes, but the rest survives. The bit about the frost, the bit about the quiet, that stays." Henry looked at the black bars again. They were no longer just scars, they were tombstones, marking the place where the truth had been interred so that the rest of the message could live. It was a terrible calculus, a trade of honesty for survival, but in the mud of Ploegsteert, survival was the only currency that held value. He dipped the pen one last time, the ink reservoir nearly empty, and signed his name beneath the lies. "Your loving son, Henry." The signature looked small, insignificant against the weight of the unsaid. He blotted the page with a scrap of newspaper, the ink smearing slightly as the damp paper absorbed the excess, leaving a grey ghost of the words behind. He folded the letter carefully, aligning the edges with a precision that felt ritualistic, then slipped it into the envelope that already bore his mother's address, written in a hand that felt like it belonged to a stranger. He sealed the flap, licking the gum that tasted of starch and dust, pressing it down firm until it held. The letter was done. It was an artifact of a war that existed only in the space between what was written and what was read, a message in a bottle cast into a sea of censorship and delay. "Ready?" Arthur asked. He had finished the cigarette, grinding the stub into the mud with his heel. "Ready." Henry placed the letter on top of the small pile of outgoing post by the dugout entrance, where the runner would collect it at dawn. It sat there, innocuous and white, hiding the black wounds within. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the wire and the broken trees, a low, mournful sound that carried the scent of snow and distant smoke. Somewhere over the parapet, a voice began to sing, faint and muffled by the distance, a German lullaby that drifted across the no-man's land before being cut off abruptly by the crack of a rifle shot. Henry flinched. Arthur did not. "Quiet day," Arthur said, his voice flat in the darkness, "just like you wrote." Henry reached for his scarf, pulling the wool tight around his neck, feeling the rough texture against his skin, grounding himself in the physical reality of the trench, while the letter began its long, slow journey to a world that no longer existed. The silence returned, heavier than before, filled with the weight of all the things they would never say. A boot scraped on the ladder above. The runner was early. Suction held the boot. Henry twisted his ankle, grinding the leather against the clay, but the trench floor refused to release him. A wet slurp echoed off the sandbags when he finally wrenched his foot free, leaving the sole behind in the grey slurry. He stood on one leg, balancing against the revetment, toes curling inside the damp sock. Cold water seeped through the putty wrap, climbing the wool like a slow fire. March had broken the frost. The crisp white silence of December was gone, replaced by this liquid rot. The trench walls sweated. Water beaded on the chalky surface and ran in rivulets to join the floor, turning the communication line into a stream that carried refuse, empty tins, and things too shapeless to name towards the sump. The air hung heavy, wet wool, cordite, the damp, fungal scent of drying putties that never truly dried. Henry sat on a sandbag, knees drawn up to create a desk. He uncorked the inkwell. The liquid inside was black, viscous, warming slowly against the heat of his palm where he had cupped the bottle for the last 10 minutes. Below zero, the ink froze solid. Now it flowed, but the paper fought back. The sheet curled at the edges, dampness wicking from the trench air into the fibers, causing the nib to catch and spatter. He dipped the pen. "Dearest Cicely." The words looked dark against the grey paper. He paused. A rat scuttled along the fire step behind him, nails clicking on the wood. Henry did not turn. Killing them took energy he did not have. "The weather has turned softer here," he wrote. "The frost has gone, and we have had a good deal of rain." He stopped, the nib hovered. Behind him, the trench breathed. Men shifted in the dugouts, coughing wetly. The sound of a spoon scraping a tin echoed from the left section. Henry looked at the line he had written. Rain, it was not rain. It was the sky falling down and mixing with the earth until there was no ground left, only a sucking bog that swallowed boots and men with equal indifference. Last week, a boy from Liverpool had slipped in the sump. They pulled him out by the straps of his equipment, but the mud had filled his mouth and nose before they could clear the airway, drowned in dry land. Henry crossed out rain. He wrote wet weather instead. It sounded less final. Writing to the sister again. Fred Soxmiller leaned against the parapet, smoking a cigarette rolled so tight the paper strained. He wore his usual grin, though the skin around his eyes was grey, stretched thin over the bone. He shifted his weight, and his boot made the same sucking sound Henry's had made moments before. "She likes the details," Henry said. He did not look up. Dipping the pen required concentration. A shaky hand meant a blot, and a blot meant starting the sheet over. Paper was shorter than patience. "Details," Fred snorted. He flicked ash into the mud. It hissed where it landed. "Tell her about the soup. Tell her how the cookhouse sent up hot tea this morning. That's a detail she'd like." "There was no tea." "There's never tea, but she doesn't know that." Fred pushed off the wall and stepped closer, looking down at the letter. "Tell her I'm keeping you fed. Tell her I found a tin of peaches behind the sergeant's stash. She'll picture us sitting in a garden, spoons in hand." Henry pressed the nib harder. A small blot spread like a bruise on the paper. He waited for it to dry before continuing. "Fred is well," he wrote. "He remains in good spirits." "Good spirits," Fred repeated, tasting the words. "Aye, that's the ticket. Good spirits and peach stones." He rubbed his leg just below the knee, where the fabric of his trousers was stained with a darker patch of mud. "You know, my mother writes to ask if I have enough socks. Sends a pair every week. I tell her I'm wearing them all. She thinks I'm losing them. She doesn't think I'm standing in water." Arthur Emery sat opposite them, cleaning his rifle. The bolt slid back and forth with a metallic shick-shick that cut through the damp air. He did not look up at Fred or Henry. His focus was on the oil rag, wiping the steel until it gleamed dull in the low light. "Stop talking about socks," Arthur said. His voice was flat. "It invites the attention." "Superstition," Fred laughed, but it was a dry sound, lacking the boom it had carried in January. "Since when did you believe in luck, Arthur?" "Since the mud started rising." Arthur snapped the bolt home. The click was final. "Check your wire socks, don't chatter." Fred shrugged, the movement stiff, just trying to help the lad write his poetry. Henry capped the pen. The ink had thickened again in the few minutes he had been writing. He tucked the bottle into his tunic pocket, against his ribs, where the body heat might keep it fluid for the next attempt. He folded the letter. The paper crackled, stiff with damp. "It is quiet here," he added at the bottom. "We are safe." He lied. The silence between the barrages was not quiet. It was a held breath. The air pressure changed before the shells came. One could feel it in the ears, a popping sensation like diving too deep in a pond. Today the pressure was low. The birds were absent. No larks sang over the wire. No sparrows hopped in the shell holes. The natural world had withdrawn, leaving the land to the men and the machines. Runners coming through, Arthur said. He stood up, rifle in hand, and moved to the fire step. He peered through the loophole, the brass casing of a spent cartridge glinting on the ground near his boot. Henry watched him. Arthur had changed since the frost broke. The sharp lines of his face were deeper, carved by the lack of sleep and the constant strain of listening. He moved with an economy of motion that wasted nothing. No extra steps, no unnecessary gestures. He was conserving himself for something. "Rations tonight?" Fred asked. He shifted his weight again, wincing slightly as he put pressure on the left leg. "Hot meal," Arthur said without turning from the loophole. "Bully beef and hard tack. Maybe jam if the mule train got through the communication trench." "Jam," Fred said. "Strawberry, imagining it now." "The mud is bad in the support line," Arthur said. "Half a dozen stuck fast this morning, had to be cut out." Henry looked at his boots. The leather was cracked, white salt stains marking where the water had evaporated and left the minerals behind. He thought of the letter in his hand. Cicely would read it in Broccoli. She would sit in the parlor. The clock on the mantel would tick. She would wonder why he did not write more about the flowers. There were no flowers. There was only the clay, toxic and churning, waiting for the next rain. "Who's going for the rations?" Henry asked. Fred pushed off the wall. He grimaced, a flicker of pain crossing his face before the smile returned. "Me, someone has to carry the jam." "Take 2 men," Arthur said. He finally turned from the loophole. His eyes met Henry's for a second, dark and warning. "The ground is soft. Watch the craters near the old wire." "I know the way," Fred said. He adjusted his belt, pulling it tighter around his waist. "Don't fuss, Arthur. I'll be back before the light goes." Henry stood up. The movement made his head swim. He gripped the sandbag to steady himself. "I'll come with you." "No," Fred held up a hand. "You right. Tell Cicely about the jam. I'll bring you an extra portion if the sergeant isn't looking." He turned to go, limping slightly on the left leg. The mud sucked at his boots with every step, a wet, tearing sound that echoed down the line. He reached the ladder leading up to the communication trench and paused, looking back. "Save me a sheet of paper," Fred said. "I'll write to my mother, tell her I'm wearing all the socks." He climbed the ladder. His head disappeared above the parapet. Arthur moved to Henry's side. He did not speak. He simply watched the space where Fred had vanished, his hand resting on the cold steel of his rifle. The air above the trench seemed to thicken. The birds remained absent. Somewhere far behind the lines, a horse whinnied, cut short by the wind. Henry looked down at the letter in his hand. The ink was still wet. He could smell it, sharp and chemical against the rot of the trench. He folded it again, tucking it into his pocket with the ink bottle. The warmth of his body would protect them both for a little while. A low hum started in the distance. Not the wind, not the birds. Arthur's head snapped up. He gripped the rifle tighter. "Down," Arthur said. The sound grew louder, a tearing noise in the sky like canvas ripping. Henry dropped to the fire step, pressing his back against the earth wall. The mud seemed to vibrate beneath him. Fred was still up there, in the open. The tearing noise peaked, directly overhead. The explosion did not sound like thunder. Thunder rolls. This snapped, a wet crack of a giant's whip breaking the spine of the air. Earth erupted. Not a geyser of water, but a thick, churning fountain of brown clay and shredded sandbags that rose 10 feet before collapsing back into the trench with a heavy, sucking slap. The smell hit Henry first, bypassing the noise to strike the back of his throat. Wet cordite, yes, but underneath it the sweet, cloying stench of turned soil and something organic, like a rabbit warren dug up by a terrier. Dirt rained down. Grit scraped against Henry's eyelids. He blinked, tasting the grit, spitting out a mouthful of mud that felt warm against his tongue. "Fred!" The name tore from his throat before he could think it. Henry scrambled up from the fire step, his boots sliding in the fresh slurry. The trench floor, already a liquid morass, had deepened by a foot in a second. His left boot stuck fast, the clay gripping the leather with a possessive hunger, and he had to wrench his leg free with a wet schluck sound that echoed too loudly in the sudden ringing silence. Arthur was already moving. He did not shout. He did not pause to wipe the muck from his face. He lunged towards the communication trench ladder, rifle slung, hands reaching for the rungs. "Wait," Henry gasped. He dragged his foot free again, the mud trying to keep the boot, pulling at the laces. The wirer. "Down," Arthur roared, shoving Henry backward with a force that sent him stumbling into the soft earth wall. A second shell whined in, lower this time, an angry bee seeking a target. It struck the parapet 20 yards down the line. The blast threw a curtain of water and debris over them, drenching Henry's tunic, soaking the paper in his pocket until the ink began to bleed through the fabric. When the spray settled, the silence returned, heavier than before. The air hung thick, with dust motes dancing in the grey light filtering from above. Arthur climbed, 2 rungs, 3, he vanished over the top. Henry waited, 1 heartbeat, 2. The mud oozed around his ankles, cold and invasive, seeping through the holes in his socks. He could feel the water rising, creeping up his shins. He thought of Fred's limp, the way the man had favored the left leg, the slight drag in the step that had seemed so harmless moments ago. "Someone has to carry the jam." A shout came from above, not a cry of pain, but a sharp, orders bark from Arthur. "Here, give me the other end." Henry scrambled for the ladder. His hands slipped on the wet wood, grabbing blindly until his fingers found a rung. He pulled himself up, muscle burning, until his head cleared the parapet. No man's land lay before them, a scarred wasteland of craters filled with milky water. 50 yards out, near the jagged remains of an old wire entanglement, Fred lay on his side. He was not moving. Arthur was crouched beside him, tearing at the fabric of Fred's trousers. Henry splashed forward. The ground here was worse than in the trench, a soupy mix of clay and water that offered no purchase. He slid the last few feet, landing on his knees beside them. Fred's face was grey, not pale, but the color of wet ash, stripped of all the ruddy boisterousness that had defined him since November. His eyes were open, staring at the low, leaden sky, but they did not focus on Henry or Arthur. They looked through them, fixed on some distant point beyond the clouds. A jagged tear in his trouser leg revealed the wound. It was not a clean hole. The shell fragment had gouged a deep furrow along the shin, stripping the flesh and exposing the white gleam of bone beneath. Blood mixed with the mud, turning the puddle around his leg into a dark, swirling red broth. "Socks," Arthur said. His voice was tight, controlled, but his hands moved with frantic speed as he pressed a field dressing against the wound. "Can you hear me?" Fred blinked, slowly. The eyelids seemed heavy, weighted with lead. "Jam," Fred whispered. The word was a bubble of air escaping a drowning man. "Strawberry." "Yes," Henry said. He grabbed Fred's shoulder, shaking him gently. "We have it. We're getting you down, Fred. Just hold on." Fred turned his head. The movement was stiff, mechanical. His gaze landed on Henry's face, and for a second, the fog cleared. A flicker of recognition sparked in the grey eyes. "Legs gone," Fred said. He sounded surprised, as if discussing a missing button rather than a shattered limb. "Feel numb, like it's asleep." "Don't talk," Arthur snapped. He ripped the bandage roll with his teeth, spitting the gauze onto the mud before wrapping it tighter around Fred's thigh. "Save your strength, we're lifting you." "Socks," Fred murmured. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a wet cough that sprayed blood on his chin. "Mother told me, wear 2 pairs." Henry looked at Fred's boots. One was missing. The other was caked in thick, brown clay, the laces undone. The sock beneath was shredded, soaked through with blood and water. "Ready," Arthur said. He slid his arms under Fred's shoulders. "Henry, take the legs, mind the injury." Henry grabbed Fred's ankles. The weight was surprising, dead and heavy. He lifted, trying to keep the wounded leg level, but Fred cried out, a sharp, animal sound that tore through the damp air. "Sorry," Henry choked out. "Sorry, Fred." "Doesn't matter," Fred gasped. His head lolled back against Arthur's chest. "Just cold, so cold now." They began the shuffle back to the trench. Every step was a battle. The mud tried to swallow their boots, clinging with a suction that demanded a price for every inch gained. Henry slipped, going down to one knee, but he did not let go of Fred's legs. He scrambled up, mud coating his hands, his face, his uniform. Almost there, Arthur grunted. Sweat streamed down his face, cutting clean lines through the dirt. Just a few more yards. Fred stopped speaking. His breathing had become shallow, a rapid fluttering in his chest that Henry could feel through the soles of his boots. The light in his eyes had faded again, replaced by that blank, distant stare. They reached the ladder. Arthur lowered Fred first, guiding him down run by run, while Henry supported the weight from above. When Fred's feet touched the trench floor, he let out a long sigh, his body going limp in their arms. The stretcher-bearers were already there, summoned by the runner who had ducked during the second blast. They moved with a grim efficiency that brooked no argument, strapping Fred onto the canvas without a word. "Legs bad," one bearer said to Arthur. He didn't look at Henry, he didn't look at Fred. He checked the knot on the strap, tugged it hard. "Aid post is full, might have to wait." "Get him there," Arthur said. His voice dropped an octave, dangerous and low. "Now." The bearers lifted the stretcher. Fred's head rolled to the side. His mouth opened, as if to speak one last time, to make a joke about the jam or the socks or the strawberry fields of Kent, but no sound came out. Only a bubble of blood formed at the corner of his lip, trembling for a second before bursting. They carried him away, disappearing into the gloom of the communication trench. The squelch of their boots faded, leaving Henry and Arthur alone in the fire trench. The silence returned. It was not the held breath of before. It was empty, a hollow space where a voice used to be. Henry stood by the fire step, his hands hanging at his sides. They were covered in mud and blood, Fred's blood. He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, feeling the grit, the stickiness. He looked at the spot where Fred had fallen. The mud had already begun to close over the footprint, erasing the evidence of the struggle. Arthur leaned against the earth wall, his rifle propped beside him. He pulled a cigarette from his tunic, his hands shaking slightly. He struck a match, the flare bright and harsh in the grey afternoon, and lit the tobacco. He took a long drag, holding the smoke in his lungs before exhaling a thin stream that curled up towards the sky. "He'll make it," Arthur said. He did not sound convinced. He sounded like a man reciting a line from a play he no longer believed in. Henry nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. He looked down at his tunic. The letter to Cicely was still in his pocket. He could feel the damp weight of it against his ribs, the paper likely ruined, the ink smeared into illegible blue blobs. "It is quiet here," he had written. "We are safe." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded sheet. The paper was soggy, disintegrating at the edges. He unfolded it. The words were running together, the black ink bleeding into the fibers until the sentence looked like a bruise. "It is quiet here. We are safe." Henry stared at the lie. The wind picked up, blowing across the trench, carrying the smell of wet wool and distant cordite. It whistled through the wire, a low, mournful note that sounded like a human voice calling out in the dark. He crumpled the letter in his fist. The wet paper made no sound as it collapsed. He dropped it into the mud at his feet. The clay swallowed it instantly, pulling it down until only a small ripple marked the spot where the truth had been. Arthur flicked the ash from his cigarette. He watched Henry, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Clean your hands, Henry," Arthur said softly. "There's work to do." Henry looked at his hands. The blood was drying, turning a dark brown crust on his skin. He wiped them on his trousers, but the stain remained. "What work?" Henry asked. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant. Arthur pushed off the wall. He walked to the fire step and peered through the loophole again. The sky was darkening, the clouds heavy with more rain, more mud, more weight. "The wire needs checking," Arthur said, "and the ration party didn't get through. We'll be hungry tonight." He turned back to Henry. In the dim light, he looked older than his years, the lines around his mouth deep-etched by fatigue and something else, something harder. He reached into his own tunic and pulled out a small leather pouch. It was worn smooth by use, the stitching frayed at the corners. He tossed it to Henry. Henry caught it. It was heavy, warm from Arthur's body heat. He opened the drawstring and smelled the contents, strong shag tobacco mixed with the faint, sweet scent of dried cherry wood. Arthur's pouch, the one he never shared. "Keep it," Arthur said. He turned back to the loophole, lifting his rifle. "I won't be needing it much longer." "Why?" Henry asked. He clutched the pouch tight, the leather digging into his palm. Arthur did not answer immediately. He stared out into the twilight, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. "Listen," Arthur said. Henry listened. At first he heard nothing but the wind and the drip of water from the parapet. Then faintly in the distance, a new sound began. A rhythmic thumping, deep and regular, like the heartbeat of a giant beast waking from sleep. Artillery, not the sporadic shelling of the morning, but a barrage, building, growing, coming closer. Arthur racked the bolt of his rifle. The metallic click echoed in the trench, final and absolute. "They're coming," Arthur said. "Get your rifle, Henry." The pen felt cold, a dead thing in his grip. Henry sat on the inverted biscuit box that served as his desk, the wood soft and spongy from weeks of damp. He pressed the nib to the paper, waiting for the ink to flow, but nothing came. The fluid inside the reservoir had thickened, turning into a sluggish gel that refused to move unless coaxed by the warmth of his own hand. He cupped the barrel of the fountain pen, rubbing it between his palms, trying to transfer enough body heat to liquefy the blockage. It was a ritual now, this warming of the blood before the writing of the lie. Outside, the thaw had completed its work. The crisp frost that had preserved the dead in December, turning the battlefield into a frozen gallery of grey statues, had surrendered to the relentless rain of March. The trench floor was no longer solid ground, but a churning slurry of toxic clay, a viscous soup that sucked at the boots with every shift of weight. It made a wet, tearing sound, schluck schluck, whenever man lifted his foot, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let go. The smell was worse than the cold had been. Frost masked the rot, mud exposed it. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet wool, cordite, and the damp, fungal decay of things that had been buried shallowly and were now being churned back to the surface by the constant traffic of feet. He uncapped the pen again. A single drop of blue-black ink oozed onto the nib, trembling there like a tear. "Dearest Cicely," he wrote. The letters were microscopic, cramped together to save space, squeezed into the margins of a previous draft because fresh paper was rationed more strictly than tobacco. "The weather has broken. The frost is gone, and we have rain instead. It is very wet." He stopped. The nib hovered over the page. In the dugout behind him, a rat scuttled across the duckboards, its claws clicking softly against the wood. It paused, twitching its nose at the smell of the drying blood on Henry's trousers, then darted into the shadows of the sandbags. 3 days ago, that rat would have been joined by a chorus of others, fighting over scraps of bully beef or a crust of bread dropped by Fred. Now the trench was quieter. The rats knew. They sensed the change in the rhythm, the way the men moved with a grim, mechanical efficiency, devoid of the shouting and the laughter that Fred had brought to the platoon. Henry looked at the sentence, "It is very wet." Cicely would read that in broccoli, perhaps while sitting by the fire in the parlor, the kettle singing on the range. She would imagine a nuisance, a dampness that ruined hems and made the walk to the post office unpleasant. She would not imagine Private Evans, who had slipped into a shell crater 2 nights prior and drowned in 3 feet of liquid clay, his screams muffled by the sucking mud until his lungs filled and the silence returned. She would not know that the wet was an active combatant, stripping boots from feet, freezing toes into black, dead lumps, turning the communication trenches into slaughterhouses where men died not from bullets, but from exhaustion and the sheer weight of the soil. He crossed out, "very wet." "The ground is soft," he wrote instead, "but we are dry enough in our dugouts." Another lie. The dugouts leaked. Water dripped from the ceiling in a steady, maddening rhythm, pooling on the floor, soaking into the straw that was already rotting. But he could not write about the water rising to the men's waists while they slept, about the way they had to stand for hours to keep their heads above the flood. He could not write about the way the cold seeped into the bones, a deep, aching chill that no amount of rum or movement could shift. The ink flowed easier now, warmed by his hand, but the words felt hollow. There was less to say. In November, he had filled pages with descriptions of the larks singing above the wire, the specific shade of green on a hawthorn leaf that had survived the shelling, the intricate patterns of frost on a piece of wire. He had written of nature as a witness, a comforting constant amidst the chaos. Now the birds had gone. The hawthorn was shredded, a tangle of broken branches and splintered wood. The landscape was bare, scarred by the high explosive shells that arrived without warning, calculated by grid references miles away, turning the organic soil into a toxic, churning quagmire that swallowed men without a trace. He thought of Alice's last letter. It had arrived that morning, stained with mud but legible. She had written about the price of tea rising again, about a neighbor's son who had joined the Navy, about the difficulty of finding good coal for the kitchen range. She had asked if he had enough socks, if the food was warm, if he was keeping his spirits up. Tea prices, he thought. The absurdity of it struck him with a physical blow, a dull ache in the center of his chest. Here men were dying in the mud, their bodies torn apart by shrapnel, their faces frozen in masks of surprise or terror, and his mother was worried about the cost of tea. He loved her for it fiercely, desperately, but the distance between her world and his felt insurmountable. It was not just the miles, or the channel, or the weeks of delay in the post. It was a fundamental disconnect, a rift in reality itself. Her concerns belonged to a planet that no longer existed for him. He dipped the pen again. "Do not worry about the socks," he wrote. "We have plenty. The food is hot and the officers are kind." He did not mention that the ration party had failed to get through, that they would go another night with nothing but hard biscuits that had to be soaked in tea to be edible. He did not mention that Captain Hawley had shouted himself hoarse, trying to organize a rescue for the men stuck in the communication trench, his face pale with a fear he tried to hide behind bluster. He did not mention Fred. "Fred sends his love," he had intended to write. "He lost a sock in the mud, but says he has plenty of spare." But Fred was gone. The stretcher-bearers had taken him away, and the silence he left behind was heavier than any bombardment. Henry could still see the bubble of blood at the corner of Fred's lip, trembling for a second before bursting. He could still hear the weak joke about the strawberry fields of Kent, a deflection so brave it made Henry's throat tighten. He put the pen down. His hand was shaking. There was no point in writing more. The letter was a fiction, a carefully constructed mask designed to protect Alice and Cicely from the truth. It was a kindness, Arthur had said. "They can't help us here, Henry. All we can do is stop them from worrying." But it felt like a betrayal. Every word of reassurance was a lie. Every omission was a wall built between them. He was becoming a stranger to them, a ghost who wrote letters from a place they could not imagine, speaking a language they did not understand. Arthur shifted beside him. The leather pouch sat in Henry's lap, warm and heavy. He ran his thumb over the frayed stitching, feeling the texture of the worn hide. It smelled of Arthura, of tobacco, of sweat, of the faint, metallic tang of gun oil. It was an intimate scent, the smell of a man who had accepted his fate. "They're coming." The sound was clearer now. The rhythmic thumping had grown into a low, continuous roar, like distant thunder rolling across a summer sky. But there was no lightning, no rain to wash it away. Only the shells. They were falling further back, in the reserve lines, in the artillery positions, tearing up the earth, destroying the guns, killing the horses. The prelude to the main event. Henry looked at Arthur's back. His friend was still staring through the loophole, his silhouette sharp against the grey light. He had not moved since handing over the pouch. He seemed rooted to the spot, a part of the trench itself, as solid and unyielding as the sandbags. "Arthur," Henry said. His voice was quiet, barely audible over the growing rumble. Arthur did not turn. "Don't," he said. "Don't say it." "I haven't said anything." "You were going to." Arthur's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Save your breath, Henry. You'll need it." Henry closed his mouth. He looked down at the letter, at the cramped, lying words. "We are safe." He folded the paper, tucking it into his tunic pocket next to his heart. It felt damp, the ink likely smearing again, the words running together into a blue blur. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered now but the sound of the shells, the smell of the mud, and the weight of the tobacco pouch in his hand. The barrage was closer. The ground beneath them began to vibrate, a subtle tremor that traveled up through the soles of his boots, into his legs, settling deep in his belly. Dust trickled from the ceiling of the dugout, dancing in the dim light. Arthur racked the bolt of his rifle again. The metallic click was louder this time, sharper. "Check your chamber," Arthur said, "and keep your head down." Henry picked up his own rifle. The wood was cold, the metal slick with condensation. He worked the bolt, sliding around into the chamber, feeling the resistance of the spring, the solid thunk of the bullet seating itself. He snapped the bolt closed, the sound final and absolute. Outside, the first shell of the new barrage landed. The earth jumped. A gout of mud and water erupted over the parapet, raining down into the trench, splattering Henry's face with cold, wet clay. He did not flinch. He simply wiped the mud from his eyes, gripped his rifle tighter, and waited for the world to end. The earth did not shake, it liquefied. A high-explosive shell, heavier than the earlier splinter bursts that tore at the wire, landed 10 yards forward. The concussion hit Henry's chest like a physical blow from a sledgehammer, driving the air from his lungs in a sharp, involuntary gasp. Dust, fine and toxic, coated his tongue, tasting of chalk and burnt sulfur, the flavor of a match struck in a sealed room. He curled tighter into the mud-slicked corner of the fire trench, knees drawn up to his chin, the Lee Enfield pressed hard against his ribs until the wood bruised his skin. The sky had vanished. Where the pale, watery light of dawn had filtered through the smoke an hour before, there was now only a churning, opaque gray void, a ceiling of pulverized clay and cordite fumes that pressed down with the weight of the sea. "Right." The command floated in his head, detached from any sense of purpose. He fumbled for the notebook, his fingers numb and clumsy inside the wool gloves, thick with grime. He tore a page free, the paper damp and limp, clinging to his fingertips like wet skin. He uncapped the pen. The ink, a viscous black sludge in this cold, refused to flow. He shook the nib, a frantic jerking motion, trying to force the liquid down by sheer violence. A single drop fell, blooming on the page like a fresh wound. Another shell landed, closer. The trench walls jumped inward, shedding clods of sticky clay that slapped against his tunic. The sound was different, Noah, a deep, tearing roar, as if the earth itself were being ripped open by a giant's hand, distinct from the sharp crack of shrapnel. It was the sound of industry, of mathematics applied to flesh. Henry watched the ink blot spread, the black tendrils reaching out across the white space, swallowing the date he had written, 8 May. The numbers dissolved, becoming a shapeless stain. He tried to form a letter, to scratch out "Dearest Mother," but the ground heaved beneath him, throwing his hands sideways. The pen skidded across the page, leaving a jagged, useless scar. "Damn it," he whispered. The words sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the thunder rolling overhead. He looked up. The parapet, built of sandbags and woven branches, was disappearing under rain of debris. A piece of wood, splintered and sharp, flew past his ear, embedding itself in the duckboard with a dull thud. He flinched, a reflex he could no longer control. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, beating so hard it hurt to breathe. He forced himself to stillness, to the observation that had kept him sane through the winter frost. Note the detail, he told himself, just the detail. His eyes fixed on a spot on the trench wall, 3 inches from his left temple. A shard of metal, jagged and gleaming dull gray in the gloom, had buried itself deep into the timber support. It vibrated with the impact of every nearby explosion, humming a low, deadly note. It was no bigger than a shilling, yet it held a terrible gravity. He watched it tremble, mesmerized by its motion, while the world around him dissolved into chaos. The smell of wet wool, usually a comforting scent of home, was gone, replaced by the acrid stench of exploded shells and the sweet, cloying rot of turned earth. A lull. Not there was never silence here, but a sudden drop in the frequency of the impacts. The roaring receded, moving further down the line towards the reserve positions. The dust began to settle, hanging in the air like a thick, gray fog. Henry exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that fogged in the chill air. He looked across the narrow trench. Arthur stood up. He moved with a casual deliberation that seemed insane amidst the ruin. He brushed the mud from his trousers, a habitual gesture, as if preparing for a Sunday walk in Brockley Park rather than standing in a slaughterhouse. He picked up his rifle, checking the bolt with a practiced flick of his thumb. "Wire's likely gone," Arthur said. His voice was calm, level, carrying clearly over the ringing in Henry's ears. "Got to see." "Wait," Henry said. He reached out, his hand grasping at Arthur's sleeve, but he stopped short, fingers hovering inches from the fabric. "The snipers, they'll be waiting for the lift." Arthur looked down at him. His face was streaked with mud, masking the color of his skin, but his eyes were clear, bright with a terrifying clarity. "If the wire's down, the Bosch will be over before we can blink. Someone has to look." "I'll go," Henry said. He started to rise, his legs stiff, muscles protesting after hours of crouching. "No," Arthur's voice cracked like a whip. "Stay down, Henry. Keep your head below the parapet. That's an order from a mate, not an officer." Before Henry could argue, Arthur stepped up onto the fire step. He placed one boot on the sandbagging, then the other, raising his head above the protective lip of the trench. For a second, he was silhouetted against the grey smoke, a dark, solid figure against the swirling chaos. He raised his binoculars, sweeping his gaze across no man's land, his body still, focused entirely on the task. Henry held his breath. The seconds stretched, elongated by fear. He watched the back of Arthur's neck, the line of his shoulders. "Come down," he thought. "Just look and come down." A sound, sharp, distinct, like the crack of a dry branch snapping underfoot. Arthur jerked. It was a small movement, a sudden twitch of the upper body, as if he had been strung by a wasp. The binoculars slipped from his hands, tumbling down into the mud with a soft splash. He did not cry out. He did not stagger. He simply folded, his knees buckling beneath him, and slumped sideways against the trench wall. He slid down the rough earth, leaving a dark smear on the clay, until he came to rest in a heap at the bottom of the trench, his legs tangled awkwardly beneath him. "Martha!" Henry scrambled forward, slipping in the slurry of mud and water. He dropped to his knees beside his friend, his hands hovering, unsure where to touch, afraid to cause more pain. "Arthur, speak to me." Arthur's eyes were open, staring up at the grey sky, unseeing. His mouth was slightly parted, as if he had been about to say something, to make a joke about the weather or the quality of the tea. But no sound came. His chest did not rise. The stillness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that fell over the small space between them. Henry reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched Arthur's cheek. The skin was already cooling, losing the warmth of life with frightening speed. He looked at Arthur's hands. They were still clutching the rifle, the fingers locked tight around the wood in a death grip that no amount of prying could loosen. The bayonet was gone. Henry's eyes swept the mud, searching for the glint of steel, but it was lost, swallowed by the churned earth. A tear leaked from the corner of Arthur's eye, tracking through the mud on his temple, or perhaps it was rain. Henry could not tell. He reached up, his thumb gentle, and closed Arthur's eyelids. The gesture felt intimate, final, a sealing of a book that would never be finished. The barrage resumed. The first shell of the new volley landed with a deafening crash, throwing a curtain of mud and water over them both. Henry did not flinch. He sat there in the filth, beside the cooling body of his friend, while the world exploded around them. He felt nothing. No grief, no fear, no anger, only a vast, hollow emptiness, a silence inside his head that drowned out the roar of the guns. He looked down at his notebook, lying open in the mud. The ink had run completely now, the page a black, unreadable mess. He picked it up, the paper sodden and tearing in his grip. He thought of the Christmas truce, of the tobacco shared with Saxon soldiers, of the sharpening of the steel, all of it gone, reduced to this mud, this silence, this stillness. He was alone. The realization did not hit him with a shock. It simply settled over him, cold and heavy. He was the sole keeper of the story now, the only one who remembered the way Arthur laughed, the way he sharpened his knife, the way he looked at the larks in the winter sky. If Henry died, Arthur would truly cease to exist. He tucked the ruined notebook into his tunic pocket next to his heart. It felt damp, cold, a dead weight against his ribs. He picked up Arthur's rifle, the wood slick with mud and blood. He checked the chamber, loaded, ready. He stood up, his legs shook, but he forced them straight. He looked out over the parapet, into the swirling grey smoke where the enemy waited. The boy who loved nature, who wrote letters to his mother about the beauty of the woods, was gone. He had died in the mud beside Arthur. What remained was something else, something harder, something that could survive this. He raised the rifle, the stock pressing hard against his shoulder. He peered down the sights into the fog. He waited for a target. He waited for the order to fire. He waited for the end. The word tore from Henry's throat, ragged and useless, against the incoming scream. The air changed pressure first, a physical blow that punched the breath from his lungs before the sound even arrived, flattening him against the wet clay wall as the world dissolved into white noise and flying debris. This was not the crackle of shell fragments or the sharp whistle of the earlier morning. This was the deep, guttural roar of high explosive, a sound that seemed to originate from inside the bone itself, vibrating through the teeth and settling in the marrow. The trench jumped. Sandbags, heavy with damp earth, lifted and dropped like living things, showering Henry and the stillness beside him in a cascade of gritty soil and splintered wood. Dust choked the air, thick and alkaline, tasting of crushed chalk and something sweeter, sickeningly organic, that coated the back of the tongue. Henry curled over Arthur's body, instinct driving his spine into an arch to shield the dead from the falling sky, though the gesture felt absurd, a mother hen shielding a stone from a hammer. The ground heaved beneath his knees, the toxic slurry of the Fresenberg Ridge churning as if boiled from below. Mud, warm and liquid, splashed up over his puttees, seeping through the wool, cold now against his shins. He kept his head down, eyes squeezed shut against the grit, listening to the rhythmic thud of impacts marching closer along the line, each one a distinct explosion of earth and timber that sent shockwaves rippling through the narrow ditch. Thump 10 yards left. Crash directly opposite. Whump close enough to feel the heat. Between the blasts, the silence rushed back in, a vacuum filled only by the ringing in his ears and the wet drip of water running down the trench face. He opened his eyes. The world had shrunk to the few feet of muddy floor where Arthur lay. The dead man's tunic was darkening, the fabric soaking up the spray of mud kicked up by the nearest detonation, but the body itself did not move. It remained rigid, the fingers still locked around the rifle stock in that final, unbreakable grip. Henry reached for his notebook again, a reflex born of months of habit, a desperate need to anchor the chaos in ink. His hand shook so violently the pen skittered across the page, tearing the paper. He tried to steady it, pressing the nib down, but another shell landed nearby, shaking the ground with such force that the fountain pen jumped from his grasp. It landed point down in the sludge. Ink, precious and rationed, bloomed into the mud, a dark blue flower dying instantly in the brown soup. "Damn it," he whispered. The words sounded thin, swallowed by the roar of the next volley. He stared at the ruined page. The sentences he had started earlier, the careful observations of the lark's song or the color of the sunset, were now illegible smears, drowned in the same mire that held Arthur. There was no poetry here, no narrative arc, just the mechanical grinding of artillery mathematics, reducing men and memories to coordinates and casualty lists. He looked at the parapet, where a jagged piece of shrapnel, still glowing dull red at the tip, had embedded itself in the wooden revetment inches above where his head had been moments before. The wood smoked, a thin, acrid ribbon curling up into the gray air, smelling of burnt pine and ozone. The barrage lifted, moving deeper into the support lines, leaving the fire trench in a ringing, dust-choked haze. Henry wiped his face with a sleeve that was already caked in dried clay, smearing the grime further across his skin. He looked down at Arthur. The dead man's boots were caked in the same thick, sucking clay that defined this sector, the leather worn thin at the toes. One lace had come undone, trailing in the mud. Henry reached out, his fingers stiff and numb, and touched the loose lace. He wanted to tie it. The impulse was irrational, a domestic reflex from a world of parlors and polished shoes, but his hand hovered and then fell away. There was no point. The mud would claim the boot soon enough, just as it had claimed the bayonet, just as it was claiming everything. "Private Williamson." The voice came from the shadows of the communication trench, low and strained. Captain Hawley emerged from the gloom, his uniform splattered with the same brown filth that coated them all, his cap gone, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and dirt. He did not look at Arthur immediately. His eyes swept his gaze across the line, checking the men, assessing the damage with a rapid, practiced efficiency that bordered on the inhuman. "Sir," Henry said. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, flat and devoid of inflection. "Status," Hawley demanded, stepping over a pile of collapsed sandbags. He slipped slightly on the slick floor, but recovered his balance instantly, boots squelching in the muck. "Wire intact on our sector," Henry lied. He hadn't checked. He knew he hadn't checked, but the wire was always intact until it wasn't, and stating the obvious deficit felt like surrender. "Arthur is—" He stopped, the word dead stuck in his throat, heavy and final. "Arthur is gone, sir." Hawley finally looked down. He paused, his gaze resting on the stillness of the Londoner for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a flicker of something human crossing his features before the mask of command slid back into place. He nodded once, a sharp, economical movement. "Leave him," Hawley said. The order hung in the air, brutal in its simplicity. "We can't move the bodies until the shelling stops properly," Hawley continued, his voice rising to cut through the residual ringing in Henry's ears. "And it won't stop. Not today. They're softening us up for an infantry push. I need every rifle on the parapet. Can you shoot, Williamson?" Henry looked at the captain, then back at Arthur. The dust was settling on the dead man's eyelashes, a fine grey powder that made him look as though he were made of porcelain, fragile and breakable. The teacup, knocked over in the initial blast, lay on its side, a pool of cold, dark liquid spreading slowly towards Arthur's hand. It looked like blood, but it wasn't. It was just tea. Just cold, stale tea from a ration that felt like a lifetime ago. "Yes, sir," Henry said. He stood up. His legs felt heavy, as if the mud had seeped into his bones, weighting him down, but he forced them to lock. He picked up Arthur's rifle. The wood was slick, uncomfortable in his grip, but he adjusted his hold, finding the balance point he knew so well. He stepped onto the fire step, the wood groaning under his weight, and raised the weapon. Through the sights, the world was a blur of grey smoke and shattered stumps. The horizon was gone, erased by the curtain of explosions that still rumbled in the distance. There were no birds, no larks singing their defiance against the noise, just the churned earth and the waiting silence between the shells. "Keep your head down," Hawley ordered, moving along the line to check the next machine gun post. "Wait for my word. Do not waste ammunition." Henry rested his cheek against the cold steel of the bolt. He could smell the oil on the weapon, mixed with the scent of Arthur's skin that still clung to the stock, a faint trace of soap and tobacco that was already fading, dissolving into the overwhelming stench of the trench. He closed one eye, aligning the foresight with the distant, smoke-shrouded tree line where the enemy waited. He was alone. The boy who wrote to his mother about the wonder of the woods was dead in the mud beside the man who had sharpened the steel. What remained was a pair of hands holding a rifle, waiting for the order to kill. "Sir," Henry called out, his voice barely audible over the wind that was picking up, swirling the dust into small, dancing devils along the trench floor. Hawley turned, his face grim. "What is it?" "The wire," Henry said, the lie tasting like ash. "I'll check it when the smoke clears." Hawley studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing, perhaps seeing the change in the young clerk, the hardening of the soft edges. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Wait for the smoke," Hawley agreed, "then hold the line." Henry exhaled, a long, slow breath that fogged briefly in the chill air before vanishing. He tightened his finger on the trigger guard, feeling the metal bite into his skin. The smoke was thinning. The grey curtain was lifting, revealing the scarred landscape of no man's land, littered with debris and the dark shapes of the fallen. Somewhere out there, beyond the wire, a Saxon soldier was doing the same thing, loading a rifle, waiting for the order. The silence stretched, taut and brittle. Then a movement in the mist. Henry squeezed the trigger. The report cracked like a whip in the frozen air. It was a sharp, ugly sound that tore the silence apart. The rifle kicked back against Henry's shoulder with a familiar, bruising thud. A puff of white smoke curled from the barrel, joining the lingering mist. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath in suspension. Then a figure stumbled out of the grey haze. He was clutching his chest, his face a mask of surprise rather than pain. He took 2 faltering steps towards the British wire. His boots sank deep into the churned earth. He reached out a hand as if to grasp something solid, There was nothing there but empty air. He fell forward face first into the mud. He did not move again. The stillness rushed back in to fill the void. It was heavier now, thick with the scent of cordite and wet wool. Henry lowered the rifle slowly. His hands were shaking, though he willed them to be steady. The metal felt suddenly cold and alien in his grip. He looked at the fallen man through the gap in the sandbags. The soldier lay still, a dark stain spreading beneath him. It was a Saxon, just as he had imagined. Perhaps he too had a mother who waited for letters. Perhaps he had dreamed of woods and quiet streams. Now he was just another shape in the landscape of death. Henry felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He swallowed it down with a grimace. There was no time for such weaknesses here. The trench was waking up around him. Men were peering over the parapet with wide, frightened eyes. They looked from the dead man to Henry, then back again. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling through the broken wire. It sounded like a low, mournful flute. Hawley moved then, stepping up beside the young clerk. He did not look at the body in the mud. His gaze remained fixed on Henry's profile. There was no praise in his eyes, only a cold, hard assessment. He saw the boy vanish completely in that moment. What stood before him was a soldier, forged in fire and blood. "Good shot," Hawley said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. It was not a compliment, it was merely a statement of fact. Henry nodded once, unable to find his voice. His tongue felt like lead in his mouth. He wanted to scream or perhaps to weep. Instead, he checked the breech of his rifle with mechanical precision. The brass casing ejected with a soft clink, landing in the slush at his feet. Steam rose from the hot metal in the chill air. It joined the fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. The dead man's hand twitched once, a final nerve firing in the cold. Then it was still forever. The silence stretched out again, taut and unbearable. It pressed against their chests, making breathing difficult. Men shifted their weight, their boots squelching in the mire. The smell of the trench was overwhelming now. It was a mix of damp earth, stale tobacco, and the copper tang of fresh blood. Henry closed his eyes for a second. He tried to recall the smell of the woods from his letters home. The scent of pine and damp moss seemed a lifetime away. It belonged to a different world, one that no longer existed. When he opened his eyes, the grey mist was thickening once more. It hid the horror of no man's land from view. But Henry knew what lay out there. He could see the dark shape in his mind's eye. He could feel the weight of the life he had taken. It sat upon his soul like a stone. Hawley turned away from the parapet. He walked back towards the dugout entrance. His shoulders were hunched against the cold. He looked older than he had an hour before. The war was carving lines into every face it touched. Henry watched him go, feeling utterly alone despite the men around him. They were all isolated in their own private hells. The wind picked up again, swirling the dust into small devils. They danced along the trench floor before vanishing into the gloom. Henry leaned his rifle against the sandbag wall. He rubbed his cold hands together to restore some feeling. The metal had bitten deep into his skin, leaving red marks. They would fade in time, unlike the memory of the falling man. He stared at the mud where the bubble of gas had burst. It was a small, insignificant thing in the grand scheme of death, yet it seemed to hold all the mystery of life. Why did some breathe while others stopped? There was no answer in the slurry. There never would be. The order hung in the damp air, heavier than the smoke drifting from the burnt-out farm to the left. The order hung in the damp air, heavier than the smoke drifting from the burnt-out farm to the left. Ginger Hawley had spoken it softly, a man delivering a verdict on a broken horse rather than a command to living men, his voice stripped of the usual bluster that carried over the parade ground in Brockley. He stood with his back to the parapet, hands clasped behind him, staring at the mud as if it held the answer to a sum he could not solve. The silence he left behind was not empty. It pressed against the eardrums, a physical weight that made the breath catch in the throat. Henry kept his eyes fixed on the toe of his boot, buried deep in the slurry, watching a single bubble of gas rise from the rotting earth and burst without a sound. Right then, Hawley said, the words dropped like stones. No more of it. Not a soul crosses the wire. Any man seen waving a white flag or shaking hands with the Hun will be shot for treason by his own officers. He turned then, his gaze sweeping the line, lingering for a fraction of a second on Henry's tunic, where the packet of German cigars sat like a brick of explosives. The captain's eyes were red-rimmed, the skin around them grey and papery, but the look in them was iron. He knew they had done it. They all knew. The smell of Saxon tobacco still clung to the dugout walls, sweet and foreign, mingling with the reek of wet wool and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. It was a scent that belonged to a different world, a world where men drank beer and sang songs instead of waiting for the whiz-bangs to tear them apart. Understood? Hawley asked. A murmur ran through the section, a low grunt of assent that sounded more like pain than agreement. Fred Soxmiller shifted his weight, the movement causing a wet squelch as his boot pulled free from the clay before sinking back down. He looked at Henry, his face pale beneath the grime, eyes wide and darting towards the gap in the wire, where only 12 hours ago, a Saxon soldier named Carl had handed over a box of cigars in exchange for a tin of bully beef. Understood, sir, Fred said, his voice cracked on the second syllable. Henry said nothing. He felt the heat of the cigars against his ribs, a phantom warmth that seemed to burn through the layers of wool and cotton. He thought of Carl's face, illuminated by the flare light, the way the man's hands had trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, the shared, frantic humanity of that stolen hour. To think of that now, with Hawley's threat hanging in the air like a guillotine blade, felt like a betrayal of the living and the dead alike. The truce was over. The window had slammed shut. The miracle was dead, killed by a piece of paper signed in a chateau miles away by men who smelled of lavender and clean linen. Arthur Emery moved beside him. He did not speak, did not look at the captain, but simply reached into his pocket and withdrew his small oilstone. The stone was grey and smooth, worn down by years of use, a familiar comfort in a world gone mad. He began to sharpen his bayonet, the rhythmic shhh sound cutting through the thick air. It was a mundane noise, domestic almost, the sound of a father sharpening a knife for Sunday dinner, yet here it served as a declaration of war. The steel scraped against the stone, a harsh, metallic rasp that set Henry's teeth on edge. "Don't," Henry whispered. The word barely left his lips. Arthur paused, the blade hovering inches from the stone. He looked at Henry, his expression unreadable, the lines around his eyes deepening in the gloom. "Orders are orders, Harry," he said quietly. "Best we look busy, best we look like we mean it." But he was just, Henry started, then stopped. He couldn't say the name. To say Carl's name now was to invite the bullet, to paint a target on his own back and on the backs of every man in the trench. He swallowed hard, the taste of copper flooding his mouth, sharp and metallic. "He gave us cigars, Arthur," he sang, "O Tannenbaum." "And tomorrow he'll be trying to put a bullet in your head," Arthur replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "And you'll be trying to do the same to him. That's the way of it. That's the job." He resumed the sharpening. Shhhshhh, shhhshhh. The sound was relentless, a ticking clock counting down the seconds until the normalcy of murder resumed. Henry watched the sparks fly, tiny flecks of metal that vanished instantly into the mud. He thought of the letter in his pocket, the one he had started writing to his mother before the order came. He had written of the frost, of the beauty of the moonlit no-man's land, of the strange peace that had descended upon the field. Now those words were lies, or worse, they were evidence. If the censor saw them, if Hawley saw them, they would hang him sure as anything. Fred shifted again, closer this time. "What do we do with the fags, Harry?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the scraping of the stone. "The German ones." Henry flinched. He had forgotten them. They burned against his side, an accusation written in tobacco leaf. To keep them was dangerous. To throw them away was a waste of precious currency, an insult to the memory of the truce. He looked at Arthur, seeking guidance, but the older man kept his eyes on the blade, his hand moving with steady, mechanical precision. "Bury them," Arthur said, not looking up, "deep, where the rats can't get them." "Or smoke them," Fred suggested, a desperate glint in his eye, quick-like, "before the sergeant major does his rounds." "No," Henry said firmly. The word surprised him with its force. "No smoking, not yet." He reached into his tunic, his fingers brushing the rough paper of the packet. He could feel the texture of the German printing, the unfamiliar script that looked so much like English yet was so alien. He pulled the packet out, holding it for a moment in his palm. It felt heavy, significant, a relic of a time that had lasted less than a day. He looked at Hawley, who was now walking slowly down the line, inspecting the rifles, checking the sights. The captain moved with a stiff, jerky gait, as if his joints were rusted solid. "Give them here," Henry said to Fred. Fred hesitated, then handed over his own stash, a few loose cigarettes he had bartered for with a button from his tunic. Henry combined the packets, clutching the small bundle in his fist. He would not bury them, not yet. He would keep them hidden deep in the bottom of his haversack, wrapped in oilcloth, a secret, a testament to the fact that for one night the world had made sense, that men were not just targets, but fathers, sons, brothers. Harry, Arthur warned, sensing the hesitation, "Don't be a fool." "I'm not," Henry lied. He shoved the bundle deep into his pack, pushing it down beneath the spare socks and the tin of boot polish. It disappeared into the darkness of the bag, swallowed by the mundane clutter of survival, just saving them for a rainy day. Arthur snorted, a dry, humorless sound. "It's always a bloody rainy day in this godforsaken place." The sharpening stopped. Arthur tested the edge of the bayonet with his thumb, wincing slightly as the steel bit into his skin. A single drop of blood welled up, bright red against the grey metal. He wiped it on his trouser leg, leaving a dark smear. "Ready," he announced, his voice carrying just enough to reach Hawley's ears. Hawley turned, nodding once. "Good, keep your heads down. Expect a bit of shelling at first light. They'll want to test the wire." He moved on, his boots squelching in the mud, leaving a trail of deep impressions that would soon fill with water. The tension in the trench eased slightly, the immediate threat of summary execution receding, but the atmosphere remained charged, brittle. The men exchanged glances, silent communications passing between them in the gloom. They were alone again. The enemy was the enemy once more. The line was drawn. Henry leaned back against the damp earth wall, closing his eyes. He could hear the wind picking up outside, whistling through the broken branches of the trees in Ploegsteert Wood. It sounded like a mournful tune, a dirge for the dead peace. He thought of his mother, sitting in her parlor in Brockley, waiting for a letter that would never tell her the truth. He thought of Carl, somewhere out there in the dark, probably doing the same thing, hiding his English tobacco, pretending the last night never happened. "Harry," Fred whispered, nudging his arm, "you all right?" Henry opened his eyes. The world was grey and muddy and cold. "Fine," he said, "just tired." "Reckon we all are," Fred said. He looked out towards the wire, his face drawn and haggard. "Reckon it's going to be a long winter." Henry didn't answer. He reached for his pen, the one he had used to write the letter to his mother. The ink was thick, congealed by the cold. He rubbed the barrel of the pen between his palms, trying to warm it, to make it flow again. He had to write. He had to tell her something. But what could he say? How could he explain that the world had changed in a single night, and then changed back, leaving him stranded in a no-man's land of the soul? He uncapped the pen. The nib was clogged. He scraped it against the edge of his ration tin, trying to clear the blockage. A small drop of black ink fell onto the paper, spreading like a stain, like a wound. He stared at it, mesmerized. "Write about the weather," Arthur said softly, watching him. "She likes that, says it makes her feel close to you." Henry looked at the drop of ink. It pulsed slightly, expanding into the fibers of the paper. "Yes," he said, his voice hollow, "the weather, I'll write about the weather." He dipped the pen again, the ink flowing sluggishly now, and touched the nib to the paper. The scratch of the nib was loud in the quiet trench, a harsh, grating sound that echoed the scraping of the bayonet. He began to write, the words forming slowly, painfully, each one a lie, each one a betrayal of the truth that lay buried in his pack. "Dearest mother," he wrote, "the frost has returned." He stopped. The words looked false on the page. He crossed them out with a violent stroke, the ink tearing the paper. He needed to start again. He needed to find the words that would bridge the gap between the mud and the parlor, between the living and the dead. But the gap was too wide. The silence was too deep. A sound drifted over the parapet, a single shot, then another. The Germans were testing the wire just as Hawley had predicted. The bullets cracked overhead, snapping the air like whips. Henry ducked instinctively, his hand flying to his helmet. The spell was broken. The war was back. Arthur grabbed his rifle, sliding the bolt home with a sharp click. "Here we go," he said, his voice steady, calm, "business as usual." Henry looked at him, seeing the resignation in his friend's eyes, the acceptance of the inevitable. He looked down at his letter, the ink still wet, the words unfinished. He folded the paper quickly, shoving it into his pocket alongside the German cigars. He picked up his own rifle, feeling the cold steel against his cheek. Business as usual, Henry repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He raised the rifle, peering over the sandbags, searching the darkness for a target that looked just like him. The wind howled, carrying the scent of cordite and decay. The night was young, and the killing had only just begun. The bullet struck the sandbag 3 inches from Henry's knuckle, spraying grit into his eye. He blinked, tears streaming down a face already caked in dried mud, and forced his shoulder hard against the rifle stock. The wood felt slick, greasy with the sweat of men who had held this same spot for 12 hours without relief. Above the parapet, the darkness remained absolute, a heavy curtain that swallowed the muzzle flashes of the unseen Germans firing from the other side of the wire. They were not aiming to kill, not yet. This was the testing, the prodding of a sleeping beast to see if it would bite back or simply roll over and die in the cold. "Keep your head down, Harry," Arthur shouted, his voice barely cutting through the sharp snap of lead on earth. "They're just waking up the sector." Henry pressed his cheek harder against the cold metal of the receiver, the smell of oil and old blood filling his nose. He could see nothing but the jagged silhouette of broken tree stumps against a sky that refused to lighten, yet he knew exactly where to point the barrel. The geometry of the slaughter had been drilled into them until it lived in the marrow. 40 yards out, the first line of rusted wire. 60 yards, the shell crater that looked like a gaping mouth. And beyond that, the grey blur where Carl stood, or perhaps lay flat, praying the same desperate prayers to a god who seemed to have abandoned this specific coordinate of France. "I can't see a bloody thing," Henry muttered, pulling the bolt back and feeling the resistance of the stiff spring. "Don't need to see," Arthur replied, firing a single shot into the gloom with a casual precision that made Henry flinch. "Just aim for where you heard them breathing last night. They haven't moved far." The recoil kicked hard into Henry's shoulder, a familiar bruise waking up beneath his tunic. He watched the spent cartridge case tumble through the air, catching a faint glint of starlight before vanishing into the slurry at his feet. It landed with a soft plip, joining dozens of others that marked the passage of time in this ditch better than any watch could. Time here was not measured in minutes or hours, but in rounds fired, rations eaten, and the slow, creeping rise of water around their ankles. The mud sucked at his boots, a hungry, living thing that wanted to pull him down into the dark earth, where the roots of the hawthorn trees had once drunk rain instead of blood. A rat scurried across Henry's boot, bold and fat, emboldened by the chaos to hunt for scraps of biscuit or flesh. He did not kick it away. He barely registered its presence, so focused was he on the rhythmic cycle of lift, pull, push, lock that kept him alive. Beside him, Fred was humming a tuneless fragment of a music hall song, a defiant little sound that wove between the cracks of the gunfire. It was a song about a girl in Croydon and a bicycle built for two, absurd and bright against the backdrop of industrial death. "Shut it, Socks," Arthur snapped, though there was no real heat in the command. "Save your breath for the cold." "Helps keep the fright away, Art," Fred called back, ducking as a bullet chipped the brickwork above his head. "My mother always said singing keeps the devils at bay." "Your mother isn't here," Arthur said, reloading with steady hands, "and the devils are already inside the wire." Henry squeezed the trigger again, the explosion deafening in the confined space of the fire step. He imagined the bullet arcing through the night, useless and blind, destined to bury itself in the clay or pass harmlessly over the heads of men who were, only 12 hours ago, sharing cigarettes and talking of children. The absurdity of it choked him, a physical tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the smoke. He thought of the letter in his pocket, the one with the crossed-out words and the lie about the frost. It felt heavy, a brick of lead weighing down his tunic, pressing against his ribs with every breath. How could he explain this to Alice? How could he describe the sensation of shooting at a man whose name he knew, whose tobacco he had tasted, while pretending he was an abstract enemy of the state? The firing from the German line intensified, a sudden rattling burst that sent dirt cascading down the back of Henry's neck. He hunched lower, instinct overriding reason, making himself as small as possible within the confines of the trench. The earth wall behind him felt damp and spongy, oozing a cold moisture that seeped through his greatcoat and settled into his bones. It was a deep, penetrating chill that no amount of layering could defeat, a cold that started in the soul and worked its way out to the skin. "They're angry," Fred observed, peering cautiously over the sandbags before dropping back down with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Reckon someone told them off for being too friendly." "Or Hawley reported us," Henry said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Arthur went still, his rifle resting across his knees. He turned slowly to look at Henry, his face a mask of shadows and grime. "Hawley knows what happened. We all know what happened. But talking about it won't change the orders, and it won't stop the bullets. So keep your mouth shut and your eyes open." The rebuke strung, sharp and necessary. Henry nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of fear and shame. He focused on the rifle again, on the mechanical simplicity of the weapon. It demanded nothing of him but obedience. It did not care about truces or tobacco or the shared humanity of the men on the other side. It was a tool of efficiency, designed to end life with a minimum of fuss, and in that, it was the most honest thing in the trench. A flare hissed overhead, casting the scene in a sudden, ghostly magnesium white. For a heartbeat, the world was illuminated with terrifying clarity. The twisted wire, the churned mud, the pale, upturned face of a dead man caught in the strands just beyond the British line. Henry recognized the uniform. It was the same grey field grey he had seen close up, the same color as the coat Carl had worn. The body hung there, suspended like a macabre decoration, swaying gently in the wind that had picked up speed. "Christ," Fred whispered, the song dying in his throat. "Don't look," Arthur ordered, his voice low and urgent. "Keep your head down, they'll be aiming for the light." The flare sputtered and died, plunging them back into darkness, but the image burned itself onto Henry's retina, bright and undeniable. He could still see the dangling boots, the limp hands, the terrible stillness of a form that had been moving and breathing only a day before. The contrast between the vibrant life of the truce and Thesa microcecedilonot sign silence was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. He gripped the rifle until his knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to vomit, to scream, to throw the weapon into the mud and run until his legs gave out. Instead, he breathed. In, out. The air tasted of copper and wet wool. He listened to the rhythm of Arthur's breathing beside him, steady and calm, a metronome in the chaos. He heard Fred shifting his weight, the squelch of mud, the soft curse as he slipped on a loose brick. These were the sounds of the living, the small, mundane noises that proved they were not yet ghosts. "Reload," Arthur said quietly. Henry worked the bolt, the metal sliding smoothly home. He raised the rifle again, peering into the dark where the flare had shown the horror. He could not see the body now, but he knew it was there, swinging in the wind, a silent accusation against the sky. He aligned the sights on a patch of darkness that felt wrong, that felt occupied, and waited. The night stretched out before them, endless and cold, filled with the promise of more violence, more lies, more letters that would never tell the truth. A twig snapped in the darkness ahead, sharp and distinct against the wind. Henry tightened his finger on the trigger, holding his breath, waiting for the shadow to move. The shadow held its ground, a darker patch of black against the churned earth, refusing to dissolve into the night or retreat into the safety of the German dugouts. Henry kept his finger curled around the trigger guard, the steel biting into his skin, cold enough to numb the bone, while his breath hitched in a ragged rhythm that threatened to give away their position. He waited for the crack of a rifle shot, the whistle of a bullet tearing through the air, but the only sound was the wind whistling through the barbed wire, a low, mournful tune that sounded suspiciously like a human voice trying to find a note it had forgotten. "Could be a rat," Fred whispered, the words barely audible over the rustle of dry grass. "Big one, or a stray dog looking for scraps." "Dogs don't walk on two legs, socks," Arthur muttered, his eyes fixed on the darkness, unblinking, "and rats don't snap twigs like that." Henry shifted his weight, the mud sucking at his boots with a wet, obscene noise that seemed deafening in the quiet. He wanted to shout, to ask if anyone was there, to call out Carl's name and beg for the truce to start again, but the order hung in the air between them, invisible and heavy as a steel beam, shoot on sight. The command had come down an hour ago, passed from officer to NCO in hushed tones along the communication trench, stripping away the humanity they had briefly shared and replacing it with the cold logic of the battlefield. To speak now was to invite a court-martial, to hesitate was to die. The figure moved again, a slow, shuffling drag of a boot through the slush, followed by a low groan that carried clearly across the no-man's land. It was not the sound of an enemy preparing an attack, but the cry of something broken, something bleeding out in the cold clay. Henry lowered the rifle slightly, the barrel dipping towards the mud, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a terrible, crushing recognition. He knew that sound. He had heard it yesterday when Carl had laughed, a deep, booming sound that had shaken the frost from the branches of a dead hawthorn, but now it was stripped of all joy, reduced to a wet, gurgling plea for help. "He's hit," Henry said, the words tumbling out before he could check them. "Someone's hit." "Could be a trick," Arthur replied, his voice flat, devoid of hope. "They send a wounded man out to draw us up, then cut us down when we show ourselves. Happened at Aisne, happened last week." "It's not a trick," Henry insisted, raising his voice, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from Fred. "I know the voice. It's one of them, the ones we spoke to." "Doesn't matter who it is," Arthur snapped, turning to face Henry, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Matters what the orders are. Hawley said any movement in the wire gets a bullet. You want to explain to the captain why you disobeyed a direct order. You want to tell him you were chatting with the Hun. He's dying, Art." "Then let him die," Arthur said, the cruelty of the words landing like a physical blow. "We are all dying, Henry. Some of us just take longer than others. Keep your head down." Henry stared at his friend, seeing the hard line of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the rifle with a white-knuckled desperation that betrayed his calm exterior. Arthur was right, of course. The logic of the trench was absolute, unforgiving, and brutally simple. Survival depended on obedience, on the ability to switch off the part of the brain that recognized pain in another human being, to reduce the world to targets and non-targets, friends and foes. But the groan came again, louder this time, a desperate, animal sound that tore through the darkness and lodged itself in Henry's chest, making it impossible to breathe, impossible to think, impossible to obey. He looked at the rifle in his hands, the wood smooth and worn from handling, the metal cold and indifferent. He thought of the letter in his pocket, the one he had started earlier, the one where he had lied about the cat and scratched out the rats, the one where he had promised Alice that he was safe, that the weather was crisp, that the men were in good spirits. How could he write those words now? How could he describe a world where a man could share tobacco and songs one night and be left to bleed out in the mud the next? All because of an order printed on a piece of paper miles away in a warm office. "I'm going," Henry said, his voice quiet but firm. Arthur grabbed his arm, fingers digging into the wool of his tunic. "You mad bastard, sit down." "I can't leave him there," Henry said, pulling away, the movement jerky and desperate. "Not after yesterday, not after we shook hands." "He's a Boche, Henry. He's the enemy. He's a man." The shout echoed off the trench walls, sharp and sudden, silencing the wind for a heartbeat. Fred flinched, shrinking back against the earth wall, his eyes wide with terror. Arthur released Henry's arm, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, and a deep, weary resignation. He knew he couldn't stop him. Once the decision was made, once the moral line was crossed, there was no going back. "If you go out there," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous, "you're on your own. I won't cover you, I won't lie for you." "I don't expect you to," Henry replied, swinging his legs over the parapet. The mud sucked at his boots immediately, clinging to the leather with a greedy, possessive force that tried to drag him down. He slipped, catching himself on a strand of wire that sliced into his palm, warm blood mixing with the cold slime. He froze, waiting for the shots, waiting for the hail of bullets that would tear him apart, but the German line remained silent, the only sound the continued, agonizing groan of the wounded man. Henry began to crawl, dragging his body through the slurry, every inch a battle against the sucking clay and the freezing water that seeped through his trousers. He moved slowly, painfully, keeping his head low, scanning the darkness for the glint of a rifle barrel or the flash of a muzzle. The distance seemed to stretch, the few yards of no man's land expanding into an endless ocean of mud and death. He could smell the blood now, a sharp, metallic tang that cut through the scent of wet wool and rot, guiding him towards the source of the sound. He reached the wire, the twisted metal snagging his tunic, tearing at the fabric, but he pushed through, ignoring the pain, driven by a singular, desperate need to see the face of the man he was about to save or fail. He found him tangled in the strands, a grey shape half buried in the mud, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, blood pooling dark and thick around him. Henry dropped to his knees, the cold water soaking instantly through to his skin, and reached out to touch the man's shoulder. The fabric was damp and heavy, slick with blood and mud. "Carl," he whispered, the name feeling strange and forbidden on his tongue. The man stirred, his head lifting slightly, eyes wide and unseeing in the darkness. He muttered something in German, a string of syllables that sounded like a prayer or a curse, before collapsing back into the slime. Henry fumbled for his water bottle, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unscrew the cap. He poured a little onto the man's lips, watching the liquid mix with the blood and disappear into the beard. "Hold on," Henry said, though he knew it was futile. "I'm here." Behind him, a flare shot into the sky, hissing loudly as it climbed, casting its harsh white light over the scene. Henry froze, caught in the act, exposed and vulnerable, the wounded man at his feet and the British trench at his back. He looked up, squinting against the glare, and saw the silhouettes of men in the British parapet, rifles raised, aimed directly at him. "Get back," a voice shouted, sharp and authoritative. "Get back in the trench or we fire." Henry looked at the wounded man, then at the trench, then back at the man. He made his choice. The Silent No Man's Land is not a documentary record. It is a work of historical fiction, grounded in the real life and surviving wartime letters and records of Henry Williamson Christmas truce. The names, dates, places, campaigns, and outcomes are faithful to the historical record. The dialogue, the private scenes, and the inner life are imagined, dramatized, not documented. Where the story departs from the verifiable facts, the liberty is the author's own. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Christmas truths. Henry Williamson. Primary material researched via the Internet Archive. Context via Wikipedia.